They say a king without his queen is just a man with a crown. But what happens when that queen never bowed? When she was cast out, shattered, left to rot in the shadows of an empire that worships dominance? This is the story of a woman who was rejected by the most powerful alpha alive, not because she was weak, but because she was too dangerous to control. And when she returns, she won't be asking for forgiveness. She'll be demanding blood. Stay with me until the very end of this saga. Hit that like button and drop your city name in the comments so I know my tribe is listening. The Great Hall of the Valor Empire smelled like power and polished stone. Torches lined the walls, their flames casting long shadows across faces that had learned to hide fear behind masks of respect. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of hierarchy, with the unspoken rules that governed every breath, every glance, every heartbeat in this kingdom of silver and dominance. Unravel stood at the center of it all, and she was suffocating. Her hands trembled at her sides, hidden beneath the rough fabric of a dress that marked her status as clearly as a brand. Unclaimed, unworthy. Omega. The words echoed in her mind like a verdict she'd been born into, a sentence passed down through generations of silence and submission. She could feel every eye in the room on her, dissecting her, measuring her against an impossible standard she never asked to meet. King Draxen Valor sat on his throne 20 paces away, and he looked like judgment carved from flesh. He was everything the Empire demanded of its ruler. Tall, broad-shouldered, his presence so commanding that even the generals flanking him seemed diminished by proximity. His eyes were dark, unreadable, the kind of eyes that had watched men break and kingdoms fall without flinching. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge, and Naira felt it pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. The bond had ignited 3 days ago. She'd been in the lower quarters, scrubbing floors in a kitchen that stank of grease and desperation, when it hit her like lightning through the spine, a pull so violent, so consuming, that she'd collapsed right there on the stone floor, gasping, her entire body lit up with a recognition she didn't understand. The mate bond. The thing every Omega dreamed of and every unclaimed girl whispered about in the dark. It had chosen her, and it had chosen him, the king. They dragged her to the palace within the hour. No explanation, no preparation. Just rough hands and cold commands, and the growing certainty that this was not a blessing. This was a trial. Now she stood before him, before the entire court, and the bond sang between them like a wire pulled too tight. Draxen's jaw tightened. She saw it, that barely perceptible shift in his expression, and something in her chest lurched. He felt it too. Of course he did. The bond didn't lie. It didn't care about status or hierarchy or the fact that she was nobody and he was everything. It just existed, primal and undeniable, demanding recognition. But his eyes remained cold. Chancellor Morvain stepped forward, an older man with silver hair and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He'd been whispering in the king's ear since Naira arrived, his voice too low to hear, but his intent crystal clear. This was a problem. She was a problem. Morvain cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. "Your Majesty," he began, his tone carefully neutral. "The bond has manifested. Protocol dictates acknowledgement, but the Council respectfully requests consideration of the broader implications. An unclaimed Omega with no lineage, no house, no—" Draxen raised one hand and Morvain fell silent mid-sentence. The king's gaze locked onto Naira, and she felt pinned in place, a butterfly on a board. His expression gave away nothing, but the bond pulsed between them, growing stronger, more insistent, as if it knew this moment was critical. He stood, and the room seemed to shrink around him. When he descended from the throne, each step echoed like a drumbeat. Naira's pulse hammered in her ears. Part of her wanted to run, to flee this place and these eyes, and the suffocating weight of expectation. But her feet wouldn't move. The bond held her there, stupid and hopeful and terrified all at once. Draxen stopped 3 feet away. Up close, he was even more overwhelming. His scent hit her, cedar and smoke and something darker, something that made every instinct in her body scream both run and stay. The bond thrummed, reaching for him, begging for completion. His voice, when it came, was quiet, dangerously quiet. "What is your name?" It wasn't a question. It was a command. "Unravel," she whispered. Her voice sounded small, fragile, and she hated herself for it. Naira Valen, he repeated, tasting the syllables like poison. No house, no bloodline, no claim to anything but the air you breathe. She flinched. The words were meant to cut, and they did. Your Majesty, she started, but he cut her off. Do you understand what you represent? Do you have any concept of what this bond demands of me? Of this empire? She didn't answer, couldn't answer. The bond twisted inside her, confused, hurt, searching for the warmth it promised and finding only ice. Draxon's eyes narrowed. A king does not mate weakness. A king does not tie his bloodline to nothing. This empire was built on strength, on dominance, on the absolute certainty that power recognizes power. And you, he stepped closer, and Naira's breath caught. You are an insult to everything this throne represents. The words landed like blows. Around them, the court watched in silence, hungry for the spectacle, for the drama of a king rejecting his fated mate. This would be talked about for years. This would become legend. Naira felt something crack inside her chest. Please, she whispered, and hated how broken she sounded. Please don't do this. For a moment, just one heartbeat, something flickered in Draxon's eyes. Something that might have been doubt, might have been recognition, might have been the bond itself screaming at him to stop, to reconsider, to understand that what he was about to do would break more than just her. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold, absolute certainty of a man who had never questioned his own judgment. I do not accept you, he said. The bond screamed. It wasn't a sound, not really, but Naira heard it all the same. A wail of denial, of agony, as the connection between them, the thing that was supposed to be sacred, unbreakable, shattered under the weight of his rejection. Pain exploded through her body, white-hot, searing, like every nerve ending had been set on fire. She collapsed, her knees hitting the stone floor hard enough to bruise, her hands clutching at her chest as if she could physically hold the pieces together. But there was nothing to hold. The bond was breaking, and it was taking her with it. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The pain was everywhere, consuming, drowning her in wave after wave of agony that had no end. Somewhere in the distance she heard voices, shocked murmurs, a few gasps, but they sounded muffled, irrelevant, as if they belonged to a different world entirely. Blood trickled from her nose. She tasted copper on her tongue. Her vision swam, darkening at the edges, and she wondered distantly if this was what dying felt like. If rejection could actually kill you. Maybe it could. Maybe she was the first to find out. Draxon stood over her, unmoved. His face showed nothing. No regret, no hesitation, not even satisfaction. Just the blank neutrality of a man who had made a decision and would not be swayed by the consequences. Remove her, he said flatly. Hands grabbed her arms, hauling her upright. Her legs wouldn't support her weight, and she hung between two guards like a broken doll, her vision swimming, her entire body convulsing with the aftershocks of rejection. Through the haze of pain, she looked up at him one last time. He was already turning away. The king had spoken. The decision was final. And Naira Valen, the girl who had dared to be chosen by fate, was nothing more than a mistake to be erased. They dragged her from the great hall, past rows of nobles who wouldn't meet her eyes, past generals who looked relieved, past servants who watched with pity and fear. The massive doors slammed shut behind her, and the sound echoed like the closing of a tomb. Outside the palace walls, they dumped her in the dirt. No ceremony, no explanation, just rough shoves and muttered curses, and the grinding certainty that she was being discarded like trash. One of the guards leaned down, his face twisted with disgust. You should have known better, Omega. Kings don't mate down. The other guard spat near her feet. Count yourself lucky he didn't have you executed for the insult. Then they left her there, alone in the dust, as the sun began to set over the empire that had just destroyed her. Naira lay on the ground, too shattered to move, too broken to cry. The pain was still there, a constant burning in her veins, but it was starting to change, starting to shift into something else, something that felt less like dying and more like waking up. But she didn't understand that yet. Not in that moment. In that moment, all she understood was loss and rage, and the terrible hollow certainty that everything she'd been told about mates, about bonds, about the sacred connection that was supposed to define her worth, it was all a lie. The Empire had lied to her. The bond had lied to her. And the king, the man who was supposed to be her other half, her completion, her destiny, had looked at her and seen nothing worth keeping. She closed her eyes and let the darkness take her. 3 days passed like fever dreams. Naira didn't remember most of it. Fragments came to her in flashes, stumbling through streets she didn't recognize, collapsing in an alley that smelled like rot and piss, waking up shivering under a thin blanket someone had thrown over her out of pity or disgust, she couldn't tell which. The pain from the broken bond didn't fade. If anything, it grew worse. It crawled through her veins like fire, burning hotter and deeper with each passing hour, as if her body was trying to reject the rejection itself. But something else was happening too, something wrong. On the 4th day, she woke screaming. The world was too bright, too loud. Every sense amplified to the point of agony. She could hear conversations 3 streets away, could smell the fear sweat on a man's skin from across the alley, could feel the vibrations of footsteps through the cobblestones beneath her. Her vision blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again. And in those moments of clarity, she saw things that shouldn't exist. Flashes of memory that weren't hers. A woman with silver eyes standing in a burning field. A voice speaking in a language she didn't know but somehow understood. Power, raw and ancient, flowing through veins that looked like hers but belonged to someone else. Someone older, someone erased. Naira pressed her hands to her temples, trying to block it out. But the visions kept coming. She saw a throne room, not Draxon's, something older, collapsing under the weight of a war that wasn't fought with swords but with will. She saw bloodlines being severed, power being sealed, entire histories being rewritten by those who feared what they couldn't control. And she saw herself. Not as she was now, broken, discarded, dying in an alley, but as she was supposed to be. Before they made her forget, before they made her weak. The realization hit like a fist to the gut. This isn't sickness, she whispered to the empty air. This is awakening. Her body convulsed and power erupted from her in a wave that shattered every window within 50 feet. Glass exploded outward in a crystalline spray. People screamed. Naira collapsed again, gasping, her hands glowing with a light that had no business existing in this world. The cobblestones beneath her cracked in a spiderweb pattern, and the air itself seemed to ripple with energy that tasted like ozone and fury. She stared at her palms, at the energy crackling between her fingers like lightning caught in a bottle, and felt something shift deep in her chest. Not the bond. That was still broken, still burning, a wound that wouldn't close. This was something else, something that had been locked away so long she'd forgotten it existed. Her birthright. The bloodline the Empire had tried to erase, and it was waking up angry. A woman's scream cut through the chaos. "Witch! Cursed! Someone get the guards!" Naira stumbled to her feet, her legs shaking but holding. The power still hummed under her skin, wild and uncontrolled, searching for an outlet. She could feel it building again, could feel the pressure mounting like water behind a dam. She ran. Through alleys and side streets, past markets and taverns, her bare feet bleeding on the rough stones, but she couldn't stop, couldn't risk another surge in a crowded area. The visions chased her, fragmentary and insistent, showing her pieces of a history she'd never learned. Your grandmother was Valendra the Silver-Eyed. She ruled the Eastern Territories before the Valor conquest, before they hunted her bloodline to near extinction, before they sealed the survivors and rewrote the histories to erase any record of power that didn't bow to their dominance. You are not weak. You were made to forget you were strong. Naira crashed through a broken fence and found herself in an abandoned warehouse district, far from the city center. She collapsed against a wall, gasping, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and the aftershocks of power she didn't know how to control. The bond pulsed in her chest, a constant reminder of what she'd lost. But underneath it, deeper, she felt something else stirring, something ancient and patient and utterly merciless. Her bloodline had waited generations for this moment, for a rejection brutal enough to shatter the seals, for pain deep enough to crack the conditioning, for fury strong enough to ignite the transformation. Naira looked at her hands again. The glow had faded, but she could still feel it there, just beneath the surface. Waiting. Ready. She'd spent her entire life being told she was nothing, That Omegas were weak, submissive, meant to serve and support, and never, ever challenge the hierarchy. But if that was true, why had they worked so hard to make her believe it? Why seal her bloodline if there was nothing to fear? Why reject her if she was truly powerless? The question circled in her mind, sharp and cutting, slicing through decades of conditioning like a knife through silk. And in the silence that followed, she heard her own voice, steady and cold and absolutely certain. They lied. By the end of the first week, Naira had stopped trying to understand what was happening to her. Understanding required logic, required a framework of rules that no longer applied. Her body was changing in ways that defied explanation. Stronger, faster, her senses sharp enough to border on painful. And the power was uncontrollable. It came in surges, violent and unpredictable, triggered by emotion or proximity or nothing at all. She'd obliterated a market stall just by walking past it, her distress manifesting as a shockwave that sent produce and wood exploding in all directions. Had accidentally sent a man flying across the street when he tried to grab her, his body hitting a wall with a crack that made her stomach turn. The fear in people's eyes was no longer pity, it was terror. Word spread fast in the lower districts. Dangerous Omega. Cursed. Broken bond turned her into something unnatural. Monster. Abomination. The whispers followed her everywhere, and soon, even the desperate avoided her, crossing to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. Naira fled the city before someone decided she was too much of a risk to leave alive. She traveled on foot, avoiding main roads, sleeping in abandoned barns and under bridges, stealing food when she had to because hunger was easier to manage than the alternative. The bond's absence still ached, a phantom limb that pulsed with every heartbeat, reminding her of what she'd lost. But the anger was growing. Not the hot, impulsive rage of youth, but something colder, sharper. The kind of fury that doesn't burn out because it's built on understanding, on the slow, terrible realization of exactly how thoroughly you've been wronged. Draxen had rejected her because she was weak, but she'd been made weak. Deliberately, systematically. Her bloodline suppressed, her instincts dulled, her power sealed behind layers of conditioning and hierarchy and lies designed to keep people like her compliant. The Empire didn't just demand submission, it manufactured it, and she'd believed them. Had internalized every lesson about her place, about Omega inferiority, about the natural order of dominance, had spent her entire life apologizing for existing, for taking up space, for daring to want anything beyond servitude. Not anymore. She stopped in a forest clearing 2 weeks into her exile, exhausted, starving, barely holding herself together. The bond's pain was a constant now, background noise she'd learned to function through. But the visions were getting clearer, more insistent, showing her fragments of knowledge her ancestors had tried to preserve. How to breathe through the power surges, how to ground herself when the energy threatened to overwhelm, how to reach for the strength instead of fearing it. She closed her eyes and let them come. A woman's voice, ancient and certain, speaking directly into her mind. They will try to break you. Let them. A broken thing can be remade stronger than it was before. The cracks are where the light gets in. The pain is the fire that burns away everything that was never truly you. You were never meant to be small. You were never meant to bow. You were sealed because you were dangerous. And now the seal is breaking. Remember who you are. Remember who we were. Naira opened her eyes, and they were glowing silver, bright enough to cast shadows in the darkening forest. The power surged through her, no longer random, no longer chaotic. This time she reached for it deliberately, shaped it, directed it. The air around her shimmered, and the ground beneath her feet began to crack as energy poured out in waves that bent trees and scattered wildlife and carved a perfect circle of scorched earth around her trembling form. She held it for 10 seconds before the control slipped and she collapsed, gasping, every muscle screaming in protest. But she'd done it. She'd controlled it. And control meant she could learn. Learning meant she could fight back. Chet. Meanwhile, in the capital, King Draxen Valor was discovering that rejection had consequences. It started small. A distraction here, a moment of hesitation there. He'd be in a council meeting discussing trade routes and lose his train of thought mid-sentence, his mind suddenly blank, as if something had reached in and stolen the words right out of his mouth. Would wake in the middle of the night with his chest tight, gasping for air that wouldn't come. his sheets soaked with sweat and his heart hammering like he'd been running for his life. His instincts, the absolute certainty that had always guided him, that had made him the most effective ruler the Valar Empire had seen in 3 generations, began to falter. He told himself it was stress. The upcoming alliance with the Northern Territories required delicate negotiation, and the council was pressuring him to formalize a bond with one of their high-born daughters, Lady Serana of House Thorn, specifically. Beautiful, educated, connected to half the noble houses in the empire. A perfect match on paper. Political marriages were standard, expected. This was nothing new, but the unease persisted. 2 weeks after the rejection, he stood on the palace balcony overlooking the city, and for the first time in his reign, he felt doubt. The bond should have faded by now. Severed connections didn't linger. That was the entire point of rejection, a clean break, a return to autonomy. But this felt like rot, like something festering inside him, spreading through his instincts, corroding the absolute control he'd built his entire identity around. He could feel it in quiet moments, a wrongness that sat in his chest like a stone, cold and heavy and utterly foreign. Chancellor Morvain appeared at his elbow, silent as always. His presence so familiar Draxon barely registered it anymore. "Your Majesty, the Northern envoy arrives tomorrow. Lady Serana has been briefed on expectations. The Council believes this alliance will stabilize the eastern borders and secure the trade routes we've been negotiating for." "Is it normal?" Draxon interrupted quietly, for a severed bond to continue affecting the dominant party. Morvain paused. His expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Calculation. Assessment. Severed bonds are uncommon, Your Majesty. The text suggests some residual discomfort, but nothing significant. Certainly nothing that would impair your ability to rule or form new connections. But you rejected her decisively. The bond was never completed, never consummated, never given the opportunity to fully establish itself. There should be no lasting complications." Draxon's jaw tightened. "Should be." The Chancellor stepped closer, lowering his voice though they were alone on the balcony. "If I may speak plainly, Your Majesty, the girl was nobody. A distraction at best, a liability at worst. An unclaimed Omega with no lineage, no training, no value to the Empire beyond a biological accident. You made the correct decision, the only decision. Whatever you're feeling will pass. It always does." Draxon didn't respond. But that night he dreamed of silver eyes and a pain that wasn't his. A swat. Nira's transformation didn't happen overnight. It was brutal, uneven, marked by failures and setbacks that would have broken someone who hadn't already been shattered. She learned to control the power in increments. Small manifestations first, lighting a fire with nothing but will, the flames springing to life in her cupped palms without fuel or flint. Moving objects without touching them, rocks and branches levitating in wobbly circles before crashing back to earth. Shielding herself from the elements, creating barriers of compressed air that kept rain and wind at bay. Each success came with a cost. Exhaustion that left her unable to move for hours. Pain that radiated through her bones like they were being reshaped from the inside. The constant gnawing awareness that she was rewriting herself from the inside out, becoming something that hadn't existed in generations. But she was getting stronger. And she was remembering. Not just the visions, those came regularly now. Fragmentary histories of a bloodline that predated the Valar Empire by centuries. She remembered her grandmother, a woman she'd barely known, who died when Nyra was 7. Remembered being pulled aside one night. Remembered withered hands gripping her shoulders. Remembered whispers in a language Nyra hadn't understood at the time. Hide what you are. Blend. Never draw attention. The wolves are always watching, child. They fear what they cannot control, and they destroy what they fear. Nyra had thought the old woman was senile. Now she understood she'd been trying to warn her, because attention meant death. The Empire hadn't just suppressed her bloodline, they'd hunted it, systematically, ruthlessly. Anyone who showed signs of the old power was disappeared, their families scattered, their names erased from records. The official histories claimed the Valendra line had died out naturally, peacefully integrated into the new empire through marriage and cooperation. The truth was genocide dressed up as assimilation. Nyra sat by a river 3 months into her exile, staring at her reflection in the water. She looked different. Leaner, yes, hardened by survival and constant movement. But it was more than that. Her features seemed sharper somehow, as if the person she was becoming was burning away everything soft, everything compliant, everything that had been carefully cultivated to make her acceptable. Her eyes had taken on a faint silver sheen that never fully faded anymore, a permanent mark of what she was becoming, or what she'd always been, underneath the conditioning. A presence approached from behind, footsteps deliberate, unafraid, making no attempt at stealth. Nira didn't turn. She'd sensed him minutes ago, had cataloged his heartbeat and scent, and the subtle tension in his muscles that suggested extensive combat training. "You planning to attack me, or are you just bad at stealth?" she said flatly, not moving from her spot by the water. A man's laugh, rough and genuine, echoed through the clearing. "Neither. I'm planning to offer you a drink." He stepped into view, tall, scarred, maybe 40, with the kind of face that had seen too many fights and survived them all through sheer stubbornness. He held out a canteen, and when Nira didn't take it, he shrugged and sat down on a nearby rock. "Name's Kyle," he said. "Used to be a general in the King's Army, 6th Battalion, Eastern Front. Got tired of following orders that made no sense and watching good soldiers die for bad strategy." Nira studied him carefully. Her senses told her he was alone, that his weapons were secured, that his heartbeat was steady and calm. But instinct also told her this was dangerous, not because he meant her immediate harm, but because whatever he wanted was going to change things. "What do you want?" she asked. Kyle tilted his head, his scarred face thoughtful. Heard rumors about a girl who shattered a bond with the king himself and didn't die. Heard she disappeared into the wilds and started breaking things just by existing. Heard whispers that she's got power that shouldn't be possible, that she's connected to a bloodline the Empire tried real hard to erase. His eyes met hers, sharp and assessing. Figured that was either a really good lie or a really interesting truth. Came to find out which. Nira stood slowly, power crackling faintly around her fingers like static electricity made visible. "If you're here to drag me back to the capital," Kyle raised both hands, placating but not frightened. "I'm here to tell you there are others. People who got crushed by the hierarchy, soldiers who were used up and thrown away, families who were taxed into starvation to fund the capital's expansion, entire villages that watched their children conscripted for wars that didn't benefit anyone but the noble houses. People who are tired of bowing to kings who treat them like tools." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "People who would follow someone strong enough to stand up to Drax and Valor." Nira stared at him, and something in her chest, something that wasn't the broken bond, something deeper and older, stirred. "Why would they follow me?" she asked quietly. Kale smiled, sharp and dangerous, the expression of a man who'd seen the worst the world had to offer and decided to burn it down anyway. "Because you're the first person in a generation who told the king no. Because you survived what should have killed you. Because rumors say you've got power. The Empire thought they'd wiped out centuries ago." He stood, meeting her eyes without flinching from the silver glow. "But mostly because they're desperate. And desperate people will follow anyone who gives them hope that things can change. The question is, are you that person?" Nira looked at him for a long moment, weighing his words, weighing the choice he was offering. Behind her, the river flowed on, indifferent to human drama. Above her, the sun began its descent toward the horizon. And inside her, the power of a bloodline that had refused to die pulsed steadily, waiting for her answer. "I don't know," she said finally, honestly. Kale nodded, as if he'd expected that. "Then let's find out together." He turned and started walking back into the forest, and after a moment's hesitation, Nira followed. The next 6 months were a blur of training, planning, and gathering. Kale wasn't lying. There were others. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Soldiers who'd been discarded after injuries made them useless to the military machine. Omegas who'd been abused by the system, treated as property, their bodies and choices controlled by laws that protected their abusers. Entire villages that had been taxed into poverty to fund the capital's endless expansion and the noble house's endless appetites. People who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by tearing down the empire that had failed them. Nira didn't set out to lead them, but they came anyway, because power recognizes power, and she was no longer trying to hide hers. She trained with Kael and his core group, former military, most of them hardened and brutal in their teaching methods. They taught her to fight, really fight, not just the instinctive surges of energy, but disciplined combat that combined her growing abilities with tactical precision. How to channel power through her strikes to multiply their force, how to sense opponents through their heartbeats and breathing, how to create barriers that could deflect blades and arrows, how to fight multiple opponents without losing awareness of the battlefield around her. And she learned fast. Too fast. "You've done this before," Kael muttered one day after she'd disarmed him in under 10 seconds, the third time that week she'd bested him in sparring. Naira shook her head, breathing hard but steady. "Not me. But someone in my bloodline did. I can feel them sometimes, like muscle memory that isn't mine." The visions were constant now, fully integrated into her waking consciousness. She could feel the weight of generations behind her, women who had fought and bled and been erased from history because they were too dangerous to acknowledge. They whispered to her in quiet moments, teaching her things she'd never learned, showing her techniques that hadn't been practiced in 100 years. She wasn't just awakening her power, she was reclaiming her legacy. By the time winter arrived, Naira's following had grown to over 300. They called themselves the Unbound, a pointed rejection of the Empire's hierarchy, of the idea that worth was determined by designation, or birth, or the arbitrary ranking of Alpha, Beta, Omega. And they weren't just surviving, they were winning. Small victories at first, liberating a village from corrupt tax collectors who'd been bleeding them dry for years. Intercepting supply lines meant for the capital's military, redistributing food and medicine to those who needed it. Disappearing entire patrols that got too close to their camps, leaving no bodies, no evidence, just empty armor and spreading fear. The Empire noticed. How could they not? Reports flooded the capital, rogue elements in the Eastern Territories, insurgents led by someone with unnatural abilities, entire battalions vanishing without explanation. Witnesses described impossible things, a woman who moved faster than eyes could track, soldiers thrown through the air by invisible force, weapons that simply stopped working when she looked at them. And always, always, those silver eyes. In the throne room, King Draxen Valor listened to those reports with growing unease that he couldn't name and wouldn't acknowledge. Because the descriptions all matched. Silver eyes, impossible strength, a presence that bent the air like gravity. General Thrace stood before the throne, his armor dusty from hard riding, his expression grim. "Your Majesty, the Eastern Territories are in open revolt. Whatever this insurgent leader is, she's not normal. My men are trained, disciplined, loyal, but they're terrified. Half of them refuse to engage and the other half come back changed. Shaken. I need authorization for extreme measures." Draxen's fingers tapped against the armrest of his throne, the only outward sign of his agitation. "Extreme measures." The general nodded. "Full military mobilization, scorched earth tactics. We burn them out, force them into the open, end this quickly before it spreads." Chancellor Morvain cleared his throat delicately. "Perhaps, Your Majesty, we should first understand what we're dealing with. These reports are unprecedented. A full military response might be premature." Draxen stood abruptly, cutting off the debate. "Bring me everything you have on the Omega I rejected. Every record, every witness account, every piece of information that exists." The throne room went silent. Morvain looked genuinely surprised. "Your Majesty, that was months ago. The girl is dead, surely. The bond rejection would have—" "Find her," Draxen snapped, his voice carrying the weight of absolute command. "Find out what happened to her after she left the palace. Find out if she's alive. Find out if she's involved in this." The general and the chancellor exchanged glances but didn't argue. "As you command, Your Majesty." After they left, Draxen stood alone in the throne room, one hand pressed to his chest where the bond used to sing, and felt nothing but rot spreading through his instincts like poison. But Naira's return to the Empire's borders was not an accident. It was a declaration. She stood at the edge of the Eastern Valley with Kael at her side and 300 Unbound at her back, staring across the plains toward the capital's distant spires. The winter sun hung low on the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and blood. The bond stirred in her chest, faint but undeniable. Broken, yes. Shattered, but not gone. Never gone. It pulsed with something that might have been recognition, might have been warning. After months of silence, of distance, it suddenly flared to life, as if proximity to the capital, to him, had awakened whatever remained of the connection they'd shared. Kyle followed her gaze. You sure about this? Once we cross into Imperial territory, there's no going back. They'll mobilize everything they have. This stops being raids and skirmishes and becomes war. Nira's eyes glowed silver in the fading light, bright enough that several of the unbound nearby glanced over nervously. He rejected me because I was weak, she said quietly. Because I was nobody. Because accepting me would have been beneath him, would have diminished the precious empire he's so proud of. She turned to look at Kyle, and her smile was cold and sharp as a blade. Let's see what he does when I'm not weak anymore. She stepped forward, and the ground beneath her feet cracked with power that had been sleeping for generations. The air shimmered around her, charged with energy that made hair stand on end and set teeth on edge. Behind her, the unbound followed, their footsteps synchronized, their weapons ready, their faces set with the grim determination of people who had finally found something worth fighting for. And somewhere in the capital, in a throne room built on dominance and control and the absolute certainty of hierarchy, King Draxen Valor felt the bond reignite. Not with warmth, not with joy, not with the completion it had promised, but with warning, with consequence, with the terrible crushing weight of a mistake that could not be undone. He staggered, one hand gripping the armrest of his throne to keep from falling, his chest burning with pain that had no physical source. Chancellor Morvan rushed forward. Your Majesty, are you... She's alive, Draxen gasped, the words torn from him by certainty he couldn't explain. She's alive. And she's coming. The Chancellor paled. The Omega? But that's impossible. The rejection should have... Get the generals, Draxen ordered, straightening despite the agony radiating through his chest. All of them. Full mobilization. Now. As Morvain hurried away, Draxen stood alone in his throne room, feeling the bond pulse with a rhythm that matched footsteps crossing his borders. And for the first time in his life, the king of the Valor Empire felt something he'd never experienced before. Fear. The War Council convened within the hour. Draxen stood at the head of a table carved from blackwood, maps spread before him like prophecies of violence. 12 generals surrounded him, their faces varying degrees of skeptical and concerned. These were men who had served him for years, who had executed his strategies without question, who had built their reputations on his certainty, and now they were watching him falter. General Thrace spoke first, his voice carefully neutral. Your Majesty, with respect, we need clarification. You're saying the Eastern insurgency is connected to an Omega you rejected months ago. An unclaimed girl with no training, no resources, no... She's not unclaimed anymore, Draxen interrupted. His hand pressed against his chest again, that unconscious gesture he couldn't seem to stop. The bond is active, changed, but active, which means she survived the rejection. The silence that followed was thick with implications no one wanted to voice. Chancellor Morvain cleared his throat. Survived is one thing, Your Majesty. Leading a successful military campaign is quite another. Perhaps we're conflating two separate issues. The insurgency could be unrelated, and the bond's persistence merely a biological anomaly that... I can feel her, Draxen said flatly. Right now. She's 60 miles east and moving closer. The bond doesn't lie about proximity. He looked up, meeting each general's eyes in turn. Whatever she was when I rejected her, she isn't that anymore. The reports describe abilities that shouldn't exist. Witnesses are terrified, entire patrols disappear, and every single description mentions silver eyes. General Kavros, a scarred veteran of the northern campaigns, leaned forward. The Valendra bloodline. We thought it was extinct. It was supposed to be, Morvain said quietly. The purges were thorough. 3 generations ago, we systematically removed anyone with verifiable connection to that lineage. The records are clear. Clearly not thorough enough, Thrace muttered. Draxen's jaw tightened. What do we know about the Valendra abilities? Specifics. Morvain hesitated, then gestured to an aide who hurried from the room. Moments later, he returned with an ancient tome, its leather cover cracked with age. The Chancellor opened it carefully, flipping through pages of faded text. The Valendra line predated the Empire by at least 2 centuries. They ruled the Eastern territories through what the texts call innate dominance, power that didn't require designation, that existed independent of alpha, beta, omega classifications. The histories claim they could manipulate physical force, create barriers, sense intention. Some accounts suggest they could kill with will alone. He looked up, his expression grave. They were eliminated because they refused to submit to the new hierarchy, because their existence threatened the entire structure we built the empire on, because power that doesn't recognize dominance as its source is power that can't be controlled. And you sealed the survivors instead of killing them, Draxon said. Why? Morvaine's fingers traced the text. The seals were considered more humane. They suppressed the abilities, made them dormant, allowed the bloodline to integrate into society as normal citizens. The theory was that within a few generations, the power would die out naturally. But the bond rejection broke the seal, Kavros said slowly. The trauma was severe enough to crack whatever bindings were in place. If that's true, Thrace said, then we're not fighting an insurgent leader. We're fighting someone with abilities we haven't seen in 100 years, leading people who have every reason to want the Empire destroyed, and she's getting closer every day. He turned to Draxon. What are your orders, Your Majesty? Draxon stared at the map, at the markers showing reported insurgent activity, at the calculated trajectory that would bring her forces to the capital within weeks if they maintained their current pace. The bond pulsed in his chest, insistent and wrong, no longer the promise of completion, but something sharper, something that felt like accusation. This is what happens when you reject what you cannot control. This is the consequence of putting hierarchy above truth. This is the price of your certainty. He shook off the thought. Full mobilization, he said. 5th, 7th, and 9th battalions to the eastern approach. Fortify the capital's outer defenses. Evacuate the villages in her path. I want no civilian casualties she can use for propaganda. And if we engage her directly, Thrace asked. Draxon's eyes were cold. Do whatever is necessary to stop her advance. But I want her alive. The generals exchanged glances. Your Majesty, Kavros said carefully, if she's as dangerous as the reports suggest, alive, Draxon repeated. That's not a request. After the generals filed out, Morvaine lingered. Your Majesty, may I speak plainly? Draxon nodded, still studying the map. This fixation on capturing her alive is tactically unsound. If she truly possesses Valendra abilities, she's a threat that should be eliminated, not contained. Your insistence suggests the bond is influencing your judgment more than you're willing to admit. Draxon's hands flattened on the table. You think I don't know that? You think I can't feel it pulling at every decision, whispering that she matters more than strategy, more than the Empire, more than everything I've built? Then sever it, Morvaine said simply. There are rituals. Painful, dangerous, but possible. If the bond is compromised, corrupted by the rejection, then cut it out entirely before it destroys you. Draxon was silent for a long moment. I already tried to sever it once, he said quietly. Look how that turned out. And here's the thing about consequences that people in power never understand until it's too late. When you build an empire on control, on the absolute certainty that your will shapes reality, you forget that reality doesn't actually care about your certainty. You forget that the world pushes back, that every action breeds reaction, that dominance isn't strength, it's fear wearing a crown. Draxon had spent his entire life believing that hesitation was weakness, that doubt was failure, that a king who questioned his own judgment was a king who deserved to fall. But now, standing in his war room with maps that showed an enemy he'd created closing in, he understood something his father had never taught him, something no advisor had ever mentioned, something the empire itself had been built to deny. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is admit he was wrong. He just didn't know if he had the courage for it. 60 miles east, Naira stood in the center of a captured outpost, watching her people work. The Unbound had taken the Imperial garrison without a single casualty. 30 soldiers had surrendered the moment they saw her, their weapons clattering to the ground, their faces pale with terror that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with instinct, recognizing something older than their training. She'd let them go. All of them. Stripped of armor and supplies, sent walking back toward the capital with a message. Tell your king I'm coming. Kael approached, his expression thoughtful. That's 3 outposts in 2 weeks. We're running out of easy targets. The next line of defense will be actual military, not border guards. Good, Nira said. I want them to see me coming. She turned to face him, and the silver in her eyes seemed brighter than usual, almost luminous in the dim interior of the outpost. How many do we have now? 473. Kyle consulted a worn ledger. Could be more if you'd let me recruit from the villages we've been liberating. People are inspired by what you're doing. They want to fight. Nira shook her head. No conscription. No forced service. Anyone who joins does it because they choose to, not because they feel obligated or pressured, even if it means we're outnumbered when we reach the capital. Especially then. Kael studied her for a moment. You know this isn't sustainable, right? Eventually, we'll hit a force we can't overcome. Eventually, your power won't be enough. Then I'll find more power, Nira said simply. The visions had been increasing lately, showing her things she didn't fully understand yet. Fragments of technique, pieces of knowledge, hints at capabilities she hadn't accessed. Her bloodline had been more than just warriors. They'd been architects of reality itself, bending the world through will made manifest. She was barely scratching the surface, and that thought should have excited her, should have made her feel powerful and vindicated and ready to tear down the empire that had tried to erase her. Instead, it just made her tired. Because here's what nobody tells you about revenge. It's not satisfying. It doesn't fill the hole left by betrayal. It doesn't heal the wound of rejection. All it does is give you something to do with the rage, a direction to point the pain so it doesn't consume you from the inside. But it's still consuming you, just slower. A scout burst through the door, breathing hard. They're mobilizing. 3 full battalions moving to intercept us. 5th, 7th, and 9th. Best estimates put them at around 2,000 soldiers, fully armed, supported by siege equipment. The room went quiet. Kael's hand moved to his sword. 2,000. We're outnumbered 4-1, and that's not counting whatever specialists they're bringing. This is what I was talking about. We can't win a straight fight against those numbers. Who said anything about a straight fight? Nira said. She moved to the map spread on a nearby table, her fingers tracing the terrain between their position and the approaching Imperial forces. There were valleys here, narrow passes, choke points that could negate numerical advantage if used correctly. But more than that, there was opportunity. They're expecting insurgents, she said. Guerrilla tactics, hit and run, maybe some sabotage. They're not expecting what I actually am. And what are you? Kael asked quietly. Nira's smile was sharp as a knife, a reminder of what they tried to erase. She felt the bond pulse in her chest, faint but growing stronger as the distance closed between her and Draxon. It didn't feel like connection anymore, more like a rope tied around both their necks, pulling tighter with every step they took toward each other. There was no completion waiting at the end of this, only confrontation, only the terrible certainty that some choices can't be unmade, only survived. Yeah. The Imperial Army established their position 3 days later, a textbook defensive formation in a valley that gave them clear sightlines and multiple fallback positions. General Thrace commanded from the center, his experience evident in every detail of the camp's layout. He'd fought insurgencies before, knew the patterns, the tactics, the inevitable mistakes desperate rebels made when facing professional soldiers. But as the sun set on their second day in position, something felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. The scouts he'd sent out hadn't reported back. Not late, completely absent. And the perimeter guards kept reporting movement that vanished when investigated. Shadows that didn't match the terrain, sounds that came from nowhere. His second-in-command, Captain Orel, approached with visible tension in his shoulders. Sir, the men are spooked. They're saying she's toying with us, that she could attack any time, but she's waiting, letting the fear build. Thrace scanned the darkening tree line. Psychological warfare is standard for outnumbered forces. Maintain discipline. Double the perimeter guards. Anyone who sees anything reports immediately, no matter how insignificant. Orel hesitated. Sir, with respect, the reports from the other outposts, what she can do, if even half of it is true, we might be out of our depth here. We're soldiers, Captain. Depth is irrelevant. We follow orders. But even as he said it, Thrace felt the doubt. He'd read the reports, witnessed the fear in veterans who'd faced death without flinching but couldn't explain what they'd seen in the Eastern Territories. Stories of a woman who moved like wind, who threw soldiers across courtyards without touching them, whose eyes glowed like molten silver in the dark. Stories that sounded like myth, like propaganda, like the kind of exaggeration soldiers tell around campfires. Except every witness told the same story. Every survivor described the same impossible things. Movement at the edge of the firelight made him turn. A woman stood there, alone. No armor, no weapons visible, just simple traveling clothes and eyes that glowed silver in the darkness. The entire camp seemed to freeze. Thrace's hand moved to his sword, but something stopped him. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. Like his body understood something his mind refused to accept. Naira Valen stepped forward, and the ground beneath her feet hummed with barely contained power. "General Thrace," she said, her voice carrying across the silent camp with unnatural clarity. "I'm offering you a choice." Weapons rose around the camp, hundreds of soldiers training bows and blades on her position. She didn't flinch. "Stand down," Thrace ordered. His voice was steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs. "Nobody fires without my command." He moved closer, stopping 10 feet away, close enough to see the silver light wasn't just reflection, but something emanating from within her. Close enough to feel the pressure of her presence like heat from a forge. "You're the Omega, the one the king rejected." "I was," Naira said. "Now I'm something else. You're leading an insurgency against the Empire. That's treason. I'm correcting an imbalance. There's a difference." Thrace's jaw tightened. "You've killed Imperial soldiers. I've freed villages your tax collectors were bleeding dry. I've stopped convoys carrying supplies to fuel wars nobody wanted. I've given people back choices your hierarchy took away. And I've killed exactly 0 soldiers who weren't actively trying to kill me first." She gestured to the camp around them. "You have 2,000 men here. Good men, probably. Following orders because that's what soldiers do. But ask yourself, what are they actually fighting for? The Empire's stability? The king's pride? Or a system that treats people like resources to be managed and discarded when convenient?" Thrace didn't answer. Naira stepped closer, and he felt it. The pressure of her presence intensifying, like standing too close to a cliff edge where one wrong move meant falling into something vast and unforgiving. "Here's my offer," she said. "Take your men and leave. Walk away. I have no quarrel with soldiers following orders. My quarrel is with the one giving them." "And if I refuse," Thrace said, "then you'll learn exactly what the Empire tried so hard to erase." For a long moment, they stared at each other. The camp was utterly silent, hundreds of soldiers watching, waiting for the command that would either save or doom them. Thrace thought about his men, about the reports of entire patrols disappearing, about the fear he'd seen in veterans' eyes when they talked about the Eastern Territories, about the fact that she'd walked into the middle of his camp alone and he hadn't heard a single alarm, hadn't received a single warning, as if his entire defensive perimeter had simply ceased to exist. About the way power radiated from her like heat, visible and undeniable and utterly beyond anything he'd been trained to fight. "Stand down," he said quietly. "Sir?" Orel's voice was shocked. "I said stand down. All units withdraw to secondary positions. We're pulling back. But General?" "That's an order, Captain." Thrace turned back to Naira, his expression unreadable. "I'm not doing this because I believe you're right. I'm doing this because I believe you're dangerous enough that fighting you here will get my men killed for no strategic gain. But this isn't over." "I never thought it was," Naira said. "Tell the king I'm coming for him. Not his empire, not his throne, just him. And when we face each other again, there won't be protocol or hierarchy or councils whispering in his ear. Just the two of us and the choice he made." Thrace nodded slowly. "I'll give him your message." As the Imperial Army began their withdrawal, organized and professional despite the humiliation of retreat, Kael emerged from the shadows where he'd been watching with 100 unbound positioned in the darkness. "You let them go," he said. "Not a question, just observation." "I told you," Naira replied, "this isn't about conquest. It's about correction." She watched the soldiers march away, their torches growing distant in the night, and felt the bond pulse stronger with each mile she got closer to the capital. Closer to him. "And about making him understand that rejection has consequences," she added quietly. Kael studied her profile, the silver glow fading from her eyes but never quite disappearing. "You still care about him." Naira's laugh was bitter. "I care about making him feel what I felt. That's not the same thing, isn't it? She didn't answer, because the truth was more complicated than revenge. The truth was that the bond, even broken and twisted and rotted by rejection, still connected them, still whispered that he mattered, that completion was possible, that somewhere underneath the hierarchy and the cruelty and the absolute certainty, there was a person worth saving. But she'd learned not to trust those whispers. She'd learned that instinct could lie, that bonds could be wrong, that sometimes the only way to survive was to kill the part of yourself that still hoped for redemption. Bossat. The news reached Draxon before dawn. He was in his private chambers when Morvain burst through the door without knocking, his usual composure shattered. Your Majesty, General Thrace has withdrawn. The entire force. No battle. No casualties. She walked into his camp alone and he retreated. Draxon stood motionless by the window, his back to the Chancellor. What did she say? Morvain hesitated. She said to tell you she's coming for you. Not the Empire, just you. The bond flared in Draxon's chest, so sharp he had to grip the windowsill to stay upright. Pain radiated through his ribs, his lungs, his throat, as if every organ in his body was being squeezed by an invisible hand. How far out is she now? 3 days, maybe 4. Your Majesty, we need to evacuate the outer districts, fortify the palace, prepare for siege. No evacuation, Draxon said. No siege preparations. He turned, and Morvain took an involuntary step back at the expression on his face. If she wants me, she can have me. Clear the Great Hall. Same place I rejected her. We'll meet there. Your Majesty, that's tactically insane. You'd be giving up every advantage. I don't want advantages, Draxon snapped. I want this ended, one way or another. After Morvain left, muttering about protocols and council approval and the absolute breakdown of strategic sense, Draxon stood alone in his chambers and finally acknowledged what he'd been avoiding for months. The bond wasn't just broken, it had inverted. What should have been completion had become condemnation. What should have been strength had become weakness. Every instinct that had guided him his entire life now pulled him toward the woman he'd destroyed, screaming that she mattered more than anything, more than reason, more than empire, more than his own survival. And the worst part, the part that kept him awake at night, that clawed at him in quiet moments, that made him question every decision he'd ever made, was that he couldn't tell anymore if it was the bond or something deeper. Regret, maybe. Or recognition. Because when he closed his eyes, he saw her as she'd been in that moment before he spoke the rejection. Trembling but standing, afraid but present, hopeful in a way that made his chest ache now, made him want to reach back through time and shake himself, make himself see what he was about to destroy. He'd been so certain, so absolutely convinced that accepting her would weaken him, would compromise the throne, would open cracks in an empire built on dominance and control. He'd been wrong, not about her worth necessarily, but about what strength actually meant. True strength wasn't refusing to bend. It was choosing what to bend for. And he'd failed that test so completely that the universe itself had rewritten the rules to make him pay for it. Nyra reached the capital's outer walls on the 4th day, just as the sun began to set. The Unbound had grown to nearly 600, villagers and freed soldiers joining their march, drawn by something they couldn't quite name but felt in their bones. Not conquest, not revenge, liberation. The city gates stood open. Kale stared at them, his hand on his sword. It's a trap. Obviously, Nyra said. But I'm going in anyway, then we come with you. No. This is between him and me. You stay here with the others. If I don't come back out by dawn, take everyone and disappear into the Eastern Territories. Build something better than this. Kael's jaw worked. You're really going to face him alone. After everything he did. After everything you've become. Especially because of what I've become, Nyra said. She could feel the bond now, singing louder with every step closer to the palace. Not the warmth it should have been, but not entirely hostile either. More like recognition. Like two wounded things circling each other, unable to connect but unable to separate. I need to know, she said quietly, more to herself than Kael. Know what? If this was all about the bond, or if somewhere underneath the hierarchy and the protocol and the fear of losing control, there was a person who could have made a different choice. And if there wasn't, Kael asked, if he's exactly what he seemed to be in that great hall when he rejected you, What then? Nira's eyes glowed silver in the fading light. Then I make sure he understands what it cost him. The palace halls were empty as she walked through them. No guards, no servants, no witnesses, just her footsteps echoing on stone and the pull of the bond leading her toward the great hall like a rope tied around her chest, pulling tighter with every step. She remembered these halls, remembered being dragged through them, broken and bleeding from a pain that had no physical source, remembered the eyes that wouldn't meet hers, the pity mixed with relief that it was her and not them. The doors to the great hall stood open. Draxen waited inside, alone, standing in the exact spot where he'd rejected her. She stopped at the threshold, and for a moment neither of them moved. He looked different, thinner, maybe, harder. The absolute certainty that had radiated from him before was gone, replaced by something rawer, more human. His eyes were shadowed, his jaw tight, and when he looked at her, she saw something she hadn't expected. Fear, not of her power, not of what she could do to him, fear of what he'd already done to himself. "You came," he said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in days. "You called," she replied. The bond pulsed between them, broken and reformed into something neither of them understood. It didn't feel like completion, it felt like collision, like two forces that were never meant to occupy the same space being forced together by something beyond their control. Nira stepped inside and the doors swung shut behind her with a finality that made her breath catch. "This is where it ends," she said. "One way or another." Draxen's hands clenched at his sides. "I need to understand what happened, how you survived, what you became. You want to understand?" Nira's laugh was sharp, edged with something that might have been pain or fury or both. "You rejected me because I was weak, because accepting me would have lowered you, would have tied your precious bloodline to nothing. You stood there and severed a bond that should have been sacred, in front of everyone, and you didn't even hesitate." "I hesitated," Draxen said quietly. "Not enough," Nira shot back. "Not nearly enough." The power crackled around her, responding to her anger, and Draxen felt it like pressure against his chest. The air itself seemed to thicken, to resist his breathing, and he understood viscerally what General Thrace had meant about being out of his depth. Do you know what happens when you reject someone so completely that it breaks them? When you take everything they believed about destiny and connection and fate, and you shatter it in front of an audience? It doesn't just hurt them, it frees them. She stepped closer, and he held his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to move, to retreat, to protect himself from the force of her presence. "You broke me so thoroughly that I had nothing left to lose. And when you have nothing left to lose, you stop being afraid. You stop accepting limits. You stop believing the lies they tell you about your place and your worth and what you're allowed to be." Her eyes blazed silver, bright enough to cast shadows in the torchlit hall. "So thank you, Your Majesty. Thank you for rejecting me. Because if you hadn't, I never would have discovered what I actually am." "What are you?" Draxen asked. Not a challenge. A genuine question, spoken with the kind of vulnerability he'd never allowed himself before. Nira smiled, cold and beautiful and utterly merciless. "I'm what your empire tried to erase. I'm the consequence of your certainty. I'm every choice you made coming back to demand payment." She raised one hand and power gathered around her fingers like lightning made solid, crackling and bright and undeniable. "And I'm done being afraid of men who mistake cruelty for strength." The air between them crackled with tension that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with violence barely restrained. The bond pulled tighter, painful now, as if proximity was tearing open wounds that had never properly healed. Draxen's voice was low, steady despite the pain radiating through his chest. "If you're here to kill me, do it. I won't fight you." Nira froze. "What?" "I won't fight you," he repeated. "You're right. About all of it. I rejected you because I was afraid. Not of your weakness, but of what accepting you would mean, that I might not be as in control as I thought, that the bond might matter more than the throne, that love might be stronger than dominance." He met her eyes, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I was wrong. And I'm sorry. And if the only way to balance the scales is my death, then take it. I won't stop you." Nira stared at him, power still gathered in her hand, her entire body trembling with rage and pain and something she didn't want to name. Something that felt dangerously like hope, like the stupid, naive belief that apologies could fix what had been broken. You think it's that simple? You think an apology fixes this? No, Draxen said. Nothing fixes this. But maybe understanding is a start. Understanding, Naira repeated, her voice shaking. You want to understand. The power in her hand grew brighter, and the stone beneath their feet began to crack, spiderwebs of fracture spreading outward from where she stood. Then understand this. You taught me that bonds don't matter, that hierarchy is everything, that power means never accepting anything you can't control. She stepped close enough that he could feel the energy radiating from her skin, close enough that the bond screamed with proximity and pain and the terrible possibility of completion. So I'm not going to kill you. That would be mercy. Instead, I'm going to do exactly what you did to me. Her hand pressed against his chest, right over his heart, and the bond screamed. I reject you, she said. The power flowed from her palm into his chest, not violent, but inevitable. And Draxen gasped as the bond that had been rotting inside him suddenly ignited with agony that transcended physical pain. Not death, not severance, inversion. Everything the bond had been, completion, recognition, destiny, twisted into its opposite. The pull that had drawn them together became repulsion. The promise of unity became the certainty of separation. And the pain was absolute. It felt like drowning in air, like burning in ice, like every cell in his body was being rewritten to understand loss as its natural state. Draxen collapsed to his knees, his hands clutching at his chest, and Naira stood over him, her eyes glowing with power and tears she refused to shed. Now you understand, she whispered. Now you know what it feels like. She turned and walked toward the doors, each step echoing in the silent hall, and the bond stretched between them like a rope being pulled taut. Naira! Draxen gasped through the pain. She stopped but didn't turn. This doesn't end with revenge, he said, his voice raw. It ends with both of us destroyed. Is that what you want? I don't know what I want anymore, she said quietly. You took that from me when you rejected who I was. Now I've taken it from you. The doors opened, and she walked through them without looking back. Draxen knelt alone in the great hall, the bond burning in his chest like poison that had no antidote, and understood with terrible clarity that this was only the beginning. Because she was right, rejection didn't end things, it transformed them. And what they'd become, what he'd forced them to become, was something far more dangerous than enemies. They were mirrors, each reflecting back to the other the worst of what they'd done, each unable to escape what they'd created, and neither could look away. Outside, Naira walked through the empty palace halls with silver tears streaming down her face, the bond pulling at her chest like a hook embedded in her heart. She'd wanted him to feel what she felt. She'd gotten her wish, and it felt like dying all over again. Naira made it 3 blocks from the palace before the weight of what she'd done hit her like a physical blow. She collapsed against a stone wall in an empty courtyard, her legs giving out, her breath coming in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with the bond screaming inside her chest. The rejection she'd inflicted on Draxen had rebounded through the connection like a shockwave, hitting her with almost the same intensity she'd given him. The bond didn't care who initiated the severance. It only understood loss, and now they were both drowning in it. Silver tears tracked down her face, hot and bitter. And she hated herself for crying. Hated that after everything he'd done, after the humiliation and the pain and the months of transformation, some part of her still mourned what could have been, what should have been. A hand touched her shoulder, and she spun, power flaring instinctively, only to find Kael standing there with his hands raised. Easy, he said quietly. It's just me. You were supposed to wait outside the city, she managed through gritted teeth. Yeah, well, I've never been good at following orders. Kael crouched beside her, his scarred face concerned. What happened in there? I did what I came to do, Naira said. I made him feel it. The rejection, the pain, everything. Then why do you look like you're the one who got destroyed? She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Because the truth was too complicated, too raw, too much like admitting that revenge hadn't fixed anything, that hurting him had just created more hurt, multiplying the pain instead of balancing it. The bond pulsed between them still, weaker now, but not gone. Never gone. Just changed into something that felt like mutual drowning, like they were both being pulled under by the same tide, and neither could save the other without condemning themselves. "We need to move," Kael said gently. "The city's going to wake up soon, and when word spreads about what happened in that palace, we need to be long gone." Naira nodded, letting him help her to her feet. Her legs were steadier now, the initial shock fading into something more manageable, more familiar. Pain was familiar. She could work with pain. They made their way through the pre-dawn streets toward the eastern gate where the Unbound waited. The city was quiet, holding its breath, as if it sensed something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power. And maybe it had, because here's what people in positions of control never understand about power. It's not static. It's not a thing you possess like gold or land or armies. Power is a relationship. It exists in the space between the one who commands and the ones who obey. And the moment that relationship breaks, the moment obedience becomes impossible or unthinkable, or simply too costly, the power vanishes like smoke. Draxon had built his entire empire on the certainty that his authority was absolute, but Nira had just proved it wasn't, and that proof would spread like wildfire. They were halfway to the gate when Kael suddenly stopped, his hand moving to his sword. "Something's wrong," he said. Naira felt it too. The air had changed, grown thicker, charged with tension that had nothing to do with her power. She extended her senses, searching for heartbeats, for breath, for any sign of ambush. The Unbound erupted from the shadows, but they weren't attacking enemies. They were attacking each other. Nira watched in horror as her own people turned on one another, weapons flashing in the pale dawn light, screams cutting through the quiet streets. Blood splattered on cobblestones. Bodies fell. "What the hell is happening?" Kael shouted, drawing his blade. A figure stepped out from behind a column, and Naira's blood turned to ice. Chancellor Morvain. He looked different in the dawn light. Less like the careful advisor she'd seen in the Great Hall, more like something patient and predatory that had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Forgive the dramatics," he said, his voice carrying easily over the sounds of combat, "but I needed to ensure you were sufficiently distracted." Behind him, more soldiers appeared. Not unbound. Imperial guards wearing the king's colors, their weapons drawn, their faces set with grim purpose. "You," Naira breathed. "You did this." Morvain smiled. "I've been cultivating relationships within your little rebellion for months. It's surprisingly easy to turn desperate people when you offer them what they actually want. Safety, status, the promise that if they help eliminate the unstable element, they'll be welcomed back into the Empire with pardons and positions." He gestured to the fighting around them. "About a third of your Unbound took the deal. The rest are discovering that trust is a liability in war." Kael moved to stand beside Naira, his sword ready. "You bastard." These people believed in something. They were building something better. They were building a fantasy, Morvain said, and fantasies collapse the moment they encounter reality. "You should have learned that by now." His eyes shifted to Naira, and something in his expression made her skin crawl. "You've been very useful, I must say." The king was becoming complacent, too certain in his power. He needed to be broken, humbled, reminded that even he is subject to forces beyond his control. "And you did that beautifully." "So this was always the plan," Nira said slowly, understanding dawning like ice water in her veins. "Let me survive the rejection. Let the seal break. Let me gather followers and march on the capital, all so you could break him. Not just break him," Morvain corrected. "Remake him. A king who doubts himself is a king who needs guidance, who needs a strong chancellor to steady his hand, to make the difficult decisions, to ensure the empire's survival." He stepped closer, and the soldiers moved with him, encircling the remaining Unbound who hadn't yet been cut down or captured. "You were never a threat to the empire. You were a tool to reshape it. And now that you've served your purpose, it's time to clean up the mess." "Over my dead body," Kael snarled. Morvain's smile widened. Yes, that was the idea. The soldiers attacked. Naira's power exploded outward in a wave that sent the first rank flying, their bodies crashing into walls and columns with sickening cracks. But there were too many. They kept coming, wave after wave, coordinated and professional and utterly merciless. She fought like something wild, like the bloodline awakening inside her had burned away everything civilized and left only survival instinct. Power crackled from her hands, barriers formed and shattered, Soldiers screamed as invisible force broke bones and tore weapons from their grips. But she was exhausted. The confrontation with Draxen had drained her more than she'd realized, and the bond's pain was a constant distraction, pulling at her concentration, making it hard to focus. Kale fought beside her, his sword a blur of motion, his tactical mind directing the surviving Unbound into defensive positions. But they were being overwhelmed, cut down one by one, betrayed by their own, trapped by superior numbers, dying in a city that didn't care about their dreams of liberation. This is what betrayal looks like in its purest form. Not the dramatic confrontation, not the villainous monologue revealing the master plan. Just people you trusted turning on you when someone offers them a better deal. Just allies becoming enemies because survival outweighs ideals. Just the cold realization that the world doesn't care about your righteousness or your pain or the justice you thought you were building. It only cares about power. And right now, Morvain had it. A blade got through Nira's defenses, slicing across her ribs. She gasped, stumbling, and another soldier lunged. Kale intercepted him, his sword taking the man through the throat, but the moment of distraction cost him. A spear drove through his shoulder from behind. Kale went down hard, blood spreading across the cobblestones, and Nira screamed. The power that erupted from her was unlike anything she'd manifested before. Pure rage made physical, a shockwave that didn't just push but obliterated. Soldiers disintegrated, stone crumbled. The very air seemed to tear apart under the force of her fury. When the light faded, she stood alone in a circle of destruction, breathing hard, bleeding from a dozen wounds, her eyes blazing silver bright enough to hurt. Morvain stood outside the blast radius, untouched, still smiling. "Impressive," he said, but ultimately pointless. He gestured, and more soldiers appeared, hundreds of them, flowing into the courtyard from every direction, their weapons trained on her. "You can kill me," Morvain continued. "You probably can kill all of them, but you'll burn yourself out doing it. And then what? You'll have destroyed the people you were trying to save, collapsed the city you were trying to liberate, and accomplished nothing except proving that power without control is just destruction wearing a noble mask." Nira's hands trembled, power still crackling around her fingers, her entire body screaming at her to fight, to destroy, to make them all pay for what they'd done. But Kael was bleeding out on the stones behind her. The surviving Unbound were surrounded, weaponless, terrified. And Morvain was right about one thing. She could kill everyone here, but it wouldn't save anyone. "What do you want?" she said through gritted teeth. Morvain's smile turned cold. "I want you to disappear. Take your remaining followers and vanish into the Eastern Territories. Build your little utopia out there where it can't threaten the Empire's stability. And in exchange, I let them live." He gestured to the captured Unbound, to Kael bleeding on the ground. "Refuse, and I execute them all. Starting with your general." "It's not an offer," Nira said. "It's extortion." "It's politics," Morvain corrected. "The art of managing threats without creating martyrs. Kill you, and you become a symbol. Let you go, and you become a cautionary tale. A girl who got too ambitious, who reached for power she couldn't control, who fled when faced with real opposition. Either way, you lose." Nira looked at Kael, at the Unbound, at the price of continuing this fight. She could feel her power thrumming inside her, ready to be unleashed, ready to carve a path of destruction through everyone standing against her. But at what cost? At what point does fighting for liberation become the very tyranny you're trying to escape? "Fine," she said, the word tasting like ash. "We leave." Morvain nodded. "Smart choice. You have until sundown to be beyond the city limits. After that, anyone flying your banner is considered an enemy combatant." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and one more thing. Stay away from the king. Whatever bond you think still exists between you, it's poison now, for both of you. Touch it again, and I'll make sure everyone you care about pays the price." The soldiers withdrew, taking their dead, leaving Nira standing in the ruined courtyard with the survivors of her rebellion scattered around her like broken pieces of a dream. Kael groaned, and she rushed to his side, her hands already glowing with the healing techniques the visions had shown her. The spear had missed anything vital, but the blood loss was severe. "I'm sorry," she whispered as she worked. "I'm so sorry." "Not your fault," Kael managed through gritted teeth. "Bastard played us all, but it was her fault." She'd been so focused on Draxen, so consumed by the need to make him understand, to balance the scales of rejection, that she'd missed the real threat. the one who'd been manipulating them both from the beginning. Morvain hadn't just used her to break the king. He'd used the king to break her. And now they were both exactly where he wanted them. Separated, weakened, unable to trust their own instincts because those instincts had led them into a trap so obvious they should have seen it coming, should have, but didn't. Because here's what happens when you build your identity on pain. You become blind to everything except the source of that pain. You fixate on the person who hurt you, on making them understand, on forcing them to feel what you felt. And while you're focused on that personal vendetta, the real predators circle closer, patient and careful, waiting for the exact moment when you're most vulnerable. Revenge doesn't make you strong, it makes you predictable. And predictable people are easy to control. Draxon was still on his knees in the Great Hall when Morvain returned. The Chancellor found him exactly where Nyra had left him, one hand pressed to his chest, his face pale with the kind of pain that transcends physical sensation and becomes something existential. "Your Majesty," Morvain said softly, "we need to move you to your chambers. The council will be convening shortly, and they cannot see you like this." Draxon's eyes were unfocused, distant. "She rejected me." "Yes, Your Majesty. I felt it. Everything I did to her, everything I made her feel. It came back. All of it." Morvain knelt beside him, his expression sympathetic in a way that would have seemed genuine to anyone who didn't know him well enough to see the calculation underneath. "The bond is a cruel thing when corrupted. But you will survive this, just as she survived what you did to her. And when you emerge from this pain, you will be stronger for it." "Stronger," Draxon repeated hollowly, "hardened, prepared, no longer vulnerable to the weaknesses that nearly destroyed you." Morvain helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they moved toward the private chambers. "The girl is leaving the capital as we speak. I've ensured she understands that any further contact will result in consequences she cannot afford. You will not see her again." "Good," Draxon said, but the words sounded wrong, forced, because the bond, even inverted and poisoned and screaming with mutual rejection, still pulled at him, still whispered that she mattered, that separation was wrong, that completion was possible if they could just... No. He cut off the thought before it could fully form. Morvain was right. The bond was poison, had been from the beginning. Every instinct it had given him had led to disaster. Every pull toward her had weakened him, compromised his judgment, made him vulnerable. He needed to excise it completely. Savor it beyond any possibility of reconnection. "The rituals," he said. "The ones you mentioned? To cut the bond entirely." Morvain's eyes gleamed. "They are dangerous, Your Majesty, painful beyond measure. Many who attempt them do not survive. But some do." "Yes, some do. Then prepare them. I want this done before the week is out. Your Majesty, perhaps we should wait until you've recovered from..." "Now," Draxon snapped. "I want it done now. Every day this connection exists is another day I'm compromised. Another day the Empire is vulnerable because its king is distracted by a broken bond with a woman who just invaded his capital and humiliated him in his own throne room." He turned to face Morvain, and something of his old authority reasserted itself. "I made a mistake accepting that bond in the first place. I compounded it by rejecting her publicly instead of handling it quietly. And I've spent months paying for those mistakes. No more. Cut it out. Burn it out. I don't care what it costs. I want it gone." Morvain bowed deeply. "As you command, Your Majesty. I will make the arrangements." After the Chancellor left, Draxon stood alone in his chambers and stared at his reflection in the polished silver mirror. He looked like a stranger. Haunted. Hollow. Nothing like the certain, controlled king who had ruled the Empire with absolute confidence just months ago. She had done this to him. No. He had done this to himself. By choosing hierarchy over truth, control over connection, the appearance of strength over actual strength. And now he was about to make another choice, one that felt equally wrong but necessary, one that would sever the last thread connecting him to the only person who had ever challenged him to be something other than what the Empire demanded. But what choice did he have? The bond was killing him, slowly, surely. Every pulse of it through his chest was a reminder of failure, of weakness, of the moment he'd let fear guide his hand instead of wisdom. Better to cut it out entirely. Better to become what the Empire needed him to be. even if it meant killing the part of himself that had hesitated in that great hall all those months ago. The part that had recognized something in her eyes, something that called to him in a way that had nothing to do with designation or hierarchy or political advantage. The part that might have loved her if he'd been brave enough to let it. Bites. 3 days later, the ritual began. They held it in the deepest chamber of the palace, a room carved from black stone that predated the empire itself. Ancient runes covered the walls, symbols of binding and severance, protection and sacrifice. 5 mages stood in a circle around Draxen, their hands glowing with power that felt wrong, invasive, like fingers probing at wounds that hadn't healed. The head mage, an ancient woman whose eyes had gone milky with age and arcane knowledge, approached with a blade that seemed to drink in the light. "This will hurt beyond anything you have experienced," she said. "The bond is woven into your very essence now. Removing it means cutting away pieces of yourself. You may not survive. And if you do, you will be changed, diminished in ways you cannot predict." "Do it," Draxen said. He lay back on the stone altar, and they bound his wrists and ankles with chains inscribed with more runes. Not to keep him in place, the old mage explained, but to keep his body from tearing itself apart when the pain became too much. The blade descended. It didn't cut flesh. It cut deeper. Into the space where the bond lived, that metaphysical connection that existed in the soul rather than the body. Draxen screamed. The pain was indescribable, like being unmade from the inside out, like every memory and feeling and moment shared through the bond was being ripped away, leaving bleeding holes in his consciousness. He saw her face, saw the moment the bond had first ignited between them, the recognition and hope and fear all mixed together. Saw her standing in the great hall, trembling but present, waiting for him to choose. Saw himself choosing wrong. The blade cut deeper, and the memories fractured. He saw her transformation, felt echoes of her pain as the rejection broke her, felt the power awakening in her bloodline like fire in his veins. Saw her standing over him, tears on her face, as she returned the rejection he'd given her. "No," he gasped. "Stop. Please stop." The mages didn't stop. They cut and carved and severed, methodical and merciless, and with each stroke of that terrible blade he felt pieces of himself falling away into darkness. The bond fought back. It didn't want to die. Even poisoned, even inverted, it clung to existence with desperate tenacity. It showed him what he was losing, not just the pain, but everything. The potential, the possibility, the chance, however slim, that they might find a way back to each other. That they might become something the Empire had never seen before. Partners instead of king and subject. Equals instead of alpha and omega. 2 broken things healing each other instead of destroying each other. The blade cut through that possibility like smoke, and it vanished. Draxen's screams echoed through the chamber, primal and agonized, the sound of a man being hollowed out and left to survive in the shell. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time lost meaning in that dark chamber with the runes glowing on the walls, and the blade cutting away everything that made him human. Finally, mercifully, he lost consciousness. When he woke, the bond was gone. Not just diminished or weakened, completely absent. The constant pull, the ache, the poisoned connection that had haunted him for months, all of it vanished as if it had never existed. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt empty. The old mage stood over him, her expression grave. "It is done. The bond is severed beyond any possibility of reconnection. You are free." Draxen sat up slowly, testing his body, searching for the pain that had become so familiar. Nothing. Just hollow silence where the bond used to sing. "Thank you," he said automatically. "Do not thank me," the mage replied. "What we have done today is not natural. The bond exists for a reason, even when corrupted. Removing it has consequences we cannot predict. You may find that instincts which once came naturally now elude you. That certainty you once possessed may become doubt. That control may become chaos." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "We have cut away your weakness, Your Majesty. Let us hope we have not also cut away your strength." After she left, Draxen stood alone in the ritual chamber and realized with dawning horror what he'd done. The bond hadn't just connected him to Naira. It had connected him to himself, to the part of him that questioned, that felt, that recognized truth even when it contradicted his certainty. And now that part was gone, carved away by a blade and ancient magic and his own desperate need to stop hurting. He'd wanted to be free. Instead, he'd made himself into exactly what the Empire demanded: a king without doubt, a ruler without conscience, a man who could make any decision, no matter how cruel, because he no longer possessed the capacity to feel why it might be wrong. Morvain appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Majesty, how do you feel?" Draxen looked at him, and something fundamental had shifted in his eyes. Something cold and absolute and utterly certain. "I feel nothing," he said. "And it's perfect." The Chancellor smiled. 200 miles east, in a camp hidden deep in the forest, Nira collapsed. She'd been sitting by the fire, tending to Kael's wounds, when the bond simply vanished. Not severed like before, not inverted, just gone, as if it had been erased from reality itself. The absence hit her like a physical blow. She gasped, clutching at her chest, searching for the connection that had been constant even in its corruption. Nothing. Just empty silence where Draxen used to exist. Kael was beside her instantly. "What's wrong? What happened?" "He cut it," she whispered. "He severed the bond completely. I can't feel him anymore. I can't feel anything." And the worst part was the relief that came with the emptiness, the terrible, guilty relief that the pain was finally gone, that she no longer had to carry the weight of connection to the man who'd destroyed her. But underneath the relief was grief. Because, however poisoned the bond had become, it had still been proof that she'd mattered to someone. That somewhere in the universe there was a person whose existence was fundamentally entangled with hers. And now there wasn't. Now she was just alone. Truly, completely alone in a way she'd never been before. The Unbound watched her with worried eyes. These people she'd led and failed, whose trust she'd squandered by being so focused on personal vendetta that she'd missed the knife aimed at all their backs. "What do we do now?" someone asked quietly. Nira looked at them, at these survivors of Morvain's betrayal, at the remnants of a rebellion that had been manipulated from its inception. "We survive," she said. "We rebuild. Not here, not under the Empire's shadow. Somewhere new. Somewhere we can actually build what we claimed we were fighting for." "And revenge?" Kael asked carefully. "What about Draxen? What about Morvain?" Nira stood, her legs steady despite the absence screaming in her chest. "Draxen chose to cut me out completely. He made his decision. I have to respect it." She looked toward the west, toward the capital she'd never see again. "As for Morvain, he's won this round. But men like him always overreach eventually, always get too confident. And when he does, when the empire he's manipulating starts to crack under the weight of his ambition," she smiled, sharp and cold and completely without mercy. "I'll be there to watch it burn." Because she'd learned something in that palace, in the moment Draxen had knelt before her in mutual agony. Revenge doesn't heal wounds, but patience does. And she had nothing but time to become something the Chancellor had never planned for. Not a rebel, not a weapon, but a woman who'd been broken so completely that she'd learned to rebuild herself into something entirely new. Something that didn't need bonds or validation or the approval of men who saw people as pieces on a board. Something that could survive anything, even abandonment, even betrayal. Even the terrible knowledge that the person who was supposed to be her other half had chosen to erase her from his existence entirely. She would survive it, and she would become something neither Draxen nor Morvain had accounted for. Free. 6 months. That's how long it took for Morvain's empire to start cracking. Nira heard about it in fragments, rumors carried by traders and refugees who fled west into the territories she'd claimed as sanctuary. Stories of the king who'd become something cold and mechanical, who made decisions with ruthless efficiency but no wisdom, who crushed dissent without mercy but also without understanding why the dissent existed in the first place. Draxen had become exactly what he'd wanted to be: certain, controlled, absolute, and the empire was rotting from within because of it. The outer provinces were in open revolt now, not because of Nira's influence, but because the king who'd severed his capacity for doubt had also severed his capacity for adaptation. He responded to every problem with force. every question with dominance, every challenge with violence. And violence, without wisdom to temper it, just breeds more violence. Kael brought her the reports each week, spreading maps across the rough wooden table in what passed for their command center. A barn converted into headquarters, humble and practical, and nothing like the palace she'd invaded months ago. "He's losing control," Kael said, pointing to markers showing rebel activity. 3 more provinces declared independence. The Northern Alliance broke their treaty. Food shortages in the capital because he executed the logistics minister for questioning a supply chain decision. Nira studied the map with eyes that no longer glowed silver unless she deliberately pulled on her power. She'd learned control in these months of exile, learned to contain the abilities that had once erupted from her without warning, learned to be patient. "Morvaine's doing this," she said, "using Draxon like a weapon. Point him at problems, let him destroy them, then step in to manage the aftermath and consolidate power." "Exactly," Kael agreed. "The Chancellor's basically running the Empire while the King takes all the blame for its failures. Classic manipulation. But here's the thing." He tapped the capital on the map. "It can't last. Eventually Draxon's going to break something Morvaine can't fix, or the people are going to rise up in numbers even the King can't suppress. And when that happens, we'll be ready," Nira finished. She'd spent 6 months building something real this time. Not a rebellion fueled by rage and revenge, but actual infrastructure. Communities where people governed themselves, where power was distributed instead of hoarded, where disputes were resolved through consensus instead of dominance. It was messy, complicated. Nothing like the clean hierarchy of the Empire. But it worked. And more importantly, it was growing. People fled the capital's brutality and found refuge in the East, found a place where their worth wasn't determined by designation or bloodline, or how well they could submit to authority. Found freedom. Because here's what tyrants never understand about power. Real strength isn't about holding everything together through sheer force of will. It's about building systems that work even when you're not there. It's about creating something that doesn't need you to function, that survives your absence because the foundation is solid, not because one person is holding up the entire structure through constant effort. Draxon had built an empire that required his absolute control to survive. Every decision filtered through him, every problem solved by his authority, every crack sealed by his dominance. And now that dominance had become mechanical, stripped of the nuance and wisdom that makes leadership something more than just tyranny with better PR. The empire was eating itself alive because its king had become a machine that only knew how to destroy. A scout burst through the door, breathing hard, his face pale with urgency. "We've got movement, Imperial forces, 5,000 strong, moving fast from the capital. They'll be here in 3 days." The room went silent. Kael stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving to his sword. 5,000. That's not a patrol. That's an invasion force. "Led by who?" Nira asked quietly, though part of her already knew the answer. The scout swallowed hard. The king himself. Something cold settled in Nira's chest. Not fear, not anymore, just recognition. This had always been coming. The final confrontation. The moment when everything they'd built would either prove strong enough to survive or collapse under the weight of the Empire's fury. "He severed the bond," Kael said carefully, his eyes on Nira. "Burned it out completely. So why come here now? Why risk everything for a fight that doesn't benefit him?" "Because Morvaine told him to," Nira said. "Because the Chancellor sees us as a threat that needs eliminating, and the king is his weapon now. Point and shoot. No questions asked. So what do we do?" Nira looked at the map, at the territories they'd built, at the communities that depended on them for protection, at the people who'd fled tyranny and found something better here in the eastern wilderness. "We evacuate the civilians, get them deep into the mountains where the Imperial forces can't follow. Then we hold the line with everyone who chooses to fight." "You're talking about going to war," Kael said flatly. "Real war. Not raids or skirmishes, actual battle against a professional army led by the most dangerous alpha in the Empire." "Yes. We'll be outnumbered 10 to 1. I know. And even with your abilities, you can't face 5,000 soldiers alone. You'll burn out. You'll die." Nira met his eyes, and something in her expression made him step back. "Then I die," she said simply. But they don't take this. They don't destroy what we've built, not without cost, not without understanding that some things are worth dying for. Because this is about more than survival now, more than revenge or justice or balancing scales that were never even in the first place. This is about proving that another way is possible, that people can live without hierarchy crushing them, without dominance defining their worth, without constant fear of the powerful deciding they're expendable. And if I have to burn myself out to protect that proof, then that's what I'll do. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then one by one, the unbound who'd gathered to hear the news stood up. "We fight," someone said, a woman who'd lost her family to imperial taxes. "We hold the line," another agreed, a former soldier who'd been discharged after losing an arm. "We show them what happens when you try to destroy people who've already survived your worst," a third added, a teenager who'd grown up in these free territories and never known the weight of the Empire's boot. Kale shook his head, but he was smiling despite the grimness of their situation. "You've made them believers. You know that? They'll follow you straight into hell if you ask." "I'm not asking," Naira said. "I'm giving them a choice. Same as always. Anyone who wants to leave, who wants to take their families and disappear deeper into the wilderness, I'll help them go. But anyone who stays does it knowing the odds, knowing we might lose, knowing that sometimes the right choice is also the choice that destroys you, because that's what real courage looks like, not the absence of fear, not some warrior's certainty that they'll prevail, but the willingness to stand for something even when standing means dying, even when every rational calculation says to run, even when the person coming to destroy you is the one who was supposed to be your other half, the one fate itself said was meant to complete you. That bond was gone now, carved out of both of them, leaving scars that would never fully heal, but the choice to stand remained. 3 days later, Draxon's army appeared on the horizon like a storm made of steel and certainty. They came in formation, disciplined and lethal, their armor gleaming in the afternoon sun. 5,000 soldiers who'd never known defeat, led by a king who'd carved doubt out of his soul and replaced it with absolute conviction. Nira stood on a ridge overlooking the valley where they'd chosen to make their stand, watching the Imperial forces deploy with mechanical precision. Behind her, 500 unbound prepared for a battle they all knew was likely suicide. But they were here anyway. That meant something. Kyle approached, his shoulder healed now but still stiff from the spear wound Morvaine's betrayal had given him months ago. "He's not even trying to negotiate," Kyle observed, watching the Imperial Army's deployment through a spyglass. No emissaries, no demands for surrender, just straight to battle formation. "That's Morvaine's influence," Nira said quietly. "The Chancellor doesn't want witnesses or conversations or anything that might remind Draxon of who we actually are. Just enemies to be eliminated." Movement in the Imperial ranks drew her attention. A single figure riding forward on a massive warhorse that looked like it could trample infantry without breaking stride. The rider's armor was black-edged with gold, the colors of absolute authority. Draxon. Even at this distance, she could see the change in him. The way he sat his horse with perfect, rigid control. The way his movements had become mechanical, efficient, stripped of anything human or spontaneous or warm. The bond's absence was a constant ache in her chest, phantom pain from a limb that had been amputated. But looking at him now, she almost felt grateful for it. Because if the bond still existed, if she could still feel what he was feeling, it would have broken her to sense the emptiness where his doubt used to live. The hollow certainty where wisdom should have been. The mechanical calculation where humanity had been excised like a tumor. He stopped 50 yards from her position, close enough that they could see each other's faces clearly across the distance. For a long moment, neither spoke. The valley held its breath. 5,000 soldiers on one side, 500 on the other, all waiting for the spark that would ignite violence. Then Draxon's voice cut across the distance, cold and certain and utterly devoid of recognition. "Naira Valen, you are in violation of Imperial law. Surrender yourself and your forces, and I will grant clemency to those who were misled by your insurgency." Nira almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Clemency. From the man who'd rejected her so thoroughly, he'd carved their connection out of his own soul, who'd spent 6 months becoming the perfect weapon for a chancellor who saw people as pieces on a board. "No," she called back simply. "Then you will be destroyed. Maybe. but you'll bleed for it. Draxon's expression didn't change. He'd become a mask of authority, nothing human left in the eyes that had once looked at her with something that might have been recognition, might have been the beginning of something real before fear and hierarchy strangled it. "You cannot win this battle," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Surrender now and minimize casualties." "I'm not trying to win," Naira replied. "I'm trying to make you remember." "Remember what?" "That people aren't resources. That power without wisdom is just destruction wearing a crown. That cutting away your capacity to doubt doesn't make you strong. It makes you a tool for people like Morvain who know how to aim you at their enemies." She stepped forward, letting power crackle faintly around her fingers, silver light dancing in the afternoon sun. "I'm trying to make you remember that you used to be more than this." Draxon was silent for a moment and something flickered across his face, too fast to identify. Gone before it could fully form into anything recognizable as human emotion. "I remember enough," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that might have been pain if he still had the capacity for it. "I remember a girl who invaded my capital, who turned my soldiers against me, who rejected me in the same hall where I rejected her, with the same cruelty, the same certainty that she was right and I was wrong." He drew his sword, the blade catching the light like captured lightning. "And I remember that mercy is weakness, that doubt compromises judgment, that a king who hesitates is a king who fails his empire." "Then you remember wrong," Naira said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest, "because the king who stands before me right now has already failed. You just can't see it yet." Draxon raised his sword, the signal to attack, and the Imperial army surged forward like a wave of steel and violence. And Nira met them with power that had been building for 6 months, refined and controlled and absolutely lethal. The first wave hit her barriers and shattered like glass against stone. Soldiers flew backward, their weapons torn from their hands, their formations breaking apart under the force of her will made manifest. The air itself seemed to ripple with energy, silver light exploding in waves that sent men tumbling across the valley floor. But there were so many. They kept coming, wave after wave, and Nira gave ground step by step, her power carving through them, but her strength finite, draining with every manifestation. Sweat ran down her face, mixing with blood from a dozen minor wounds. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her hands trembled with exhaustion. The Unbound fought beside her, outnumbered but fierce, using terrain and desperation to offset the Imperial Army's superior numbers and training. Blood stained the valley floor, turning dirt to mud. Screams cut through the clash of steel on steel, the thud of bodies hitting ground, the raw animal sounds of combat stripped of any glory or honor. And through it all, Draxon advanced. He fought like something mechanical, his sword moving with perfect precision, cutting through Unbound defenders without hesitation or mercy. No wasted movement, no unnecessary flourishes, just efficient, brutal killing that left bodies in his wake like harvested wheat. This is what happens when you remove doubt from a warrior. You don't get clarity or strength or perfect judgment. You get a machine that knows only how to destroy whatever is placed in front of it. You get violence without wisdom, force without understanding, power that has forgotten why it exists in the first place. Naira watched him cut down people she'd lived with, trained with, built a community alongside. Watched him kill without recognition, without any sign that these were human beings with hopes and dreams and families waiting for them in the mountains. And something inside her broke. Not the way the bond had broken, not the way rejection had shattered her months ago in that great hall. This was different, deeper. The final shattering of any hope that the man she'd once believed could be her other half still existed somewhere underneath the king's armor and mechanical certainty. He was gone, carved away by ritual magic and his own desperate need to stop feeling pain. She'd mourned the bond, mourned the connection, mourned the possibility of completion, but she'd never properly mourned him. Until now. "Nira!" Kael shouted from somewhere behind her, his voice hoarse with exertion. "Fall back! You can't hold them all!" But she wasn't trying to hold them anymore. She was trying to reach him. Power exploded from her in a focused beam that carved a path through the Imperial forces, soldiers scattering to avoid the silver fire that burned without heat but destroyed anything it touched. Stone cracked, metal melted, the very air screamed under the force of it. Draxon turned to face her, his sword ready, his expression empty of anything that might have once been called human. They met in the center of the battlefield, surrounded by chaos and violence and the ruins of everything they might have been to each other. The air itself seemed to stop moving. "You want to kill me," Nira said, her voice cutting through the noise of battle. "Here I am. No barriers, no tricks. Just you and me and the choice you made." Draxon's sword rose, steady in his hand despite the blood coating the blade. "I made the right choice." "Did you?" She didn't defend herself, didn't raise her power, just stood there, waiting, her eyes locked on his, searching for any flicker of the person who'd hesitated before rejecting her all those months ago. Because here's what nobody tells you about confronting the person who destroyed you. You think it'll be satisfying. You think finally facing them, finally making them see what they did, will heal something inside you. That forcing them to acknowledge the pain they caused will somehow balance the scales. But it doesn't. It just shows you that the person you're confronting isn't the person who hurt you anymore. They've changed, moved on, carved away the parts of themselves that might have felt regret or recognized their own cruelty. And you're left standing there with all your pain and fury and nowhere to put it because the target has already destroyed themselves more thoroughly than you ever could. "Strike," she said quietly. "If that's who you are now, if you're really just Morvaine's weapon, incapable of seeing anything except enemies to eliminate, then prove it. Kill me. End this." Draxon's blade trembled. Just once, just for a heartbeat. The tremor was so slight someone watching from a distance might have missed it entirely. But Nira saw it, felt it in the space between them where the bond used to sing. Then the blade steadied, his jaw set with determination, and he drove it forward. The sword stopped an inch from her chest, not because she'd blocked it, not because he'd missed, because he'd stopped himself. His hand shook on the hilt, his entire body going rigid with the effort of fighting whatever had made him hesitate. His face twisted with something that might have been pain or confusion or the first crack in the absolute certainty he'd built his new self around. "Why won't you defend yourself?" he gasped, and the question sounded torn from somewhere deep inside him. "Because I'm tired," Nira said simply, honestly, her voice cracking with exhaustion that went deeper than physical weariness. "Tired of fighting, tired of pain, tired of watching everything I build get destroyed by men who think power means control." She stepped closer, and the sword's point pressed against her chest, drawing a single drop of blood that stained her shirt crimson. "You want to know what I remember? I remember the moment before you rejected me, when the bond ignited and I saw something in your eyes that looked like recognition, like maybe, just maybe, you were about to choose something real over something safe." Tears tracked down her face, hot and bitter, cutting clean trails through the dirt and blood. "But you didn't. You chose hierarchy. Chose the empire, chose certainty over truth, and maybe that was the right choice for a king. Maybe I was naive to think one person could matter more than an empire built on dominance and control." She reached up slowly and placed her hand over his where it gripped the sword, feeling the tremor in his fingers, the tension radiating through his entire body. "But you were wrong about one thing. Cutting away doubt didn't make you strong. It made you exactly what Morvaine needed you to be. A tool. A weapon. Something he could point at his enemies and watch destroy without conscience or question or any understanding of why." Draxon's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time in 6 months, something that looked almost human flickered in their depths. "Morvaine, he's been playing us both from the beginning. Let me survive so I'd break you. Let you sever the bond so you'd become controllable. Sent you here to destroy the one place that proves another way is possible." She smiled sadly, her hand still covering his on the sword that was still pressed against her chest. "We were so busy hurting each other we never saw the knife aimed at both our backs." Around them, the battle had slowed almost to a stop. Soldiers on both sides watching their king frozen with a sword at the throat of the woman who'd invaded his capital and somehow survived everything the Empire had thrown at her. Draxon's hand shook harder, the tremor spreading up his arm. "I cut the bond. I removed any weakness that might compromise my judgment. I made myself into what the Empire needed." "You made yourself into what Morvaine wanted," Nira corrected gently. "And now you're here, about to destroy the only person who ever challenged you to be more than a tyrant with a crown, the only person who saw you as something other than a king to obey or fear." Draxon's sword clattered to the ground, falling from nerveless fingers. He staggered backward, his hands clutching his head as if he could physically hold together whatever was fracturing inside him. And for the first time in 6 months, his face showed something other than cold certainty, pain, confusion, doubt. The very thing he'd paid so dearly to excise. "What have I done?" he whispered, and the words sounded like they were being dragged from somewhere deep inside him. The Imperial army shifted uneasily, formations breaking as soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. Their king was compromised, vulnerable, showing weakness in front of the enemy. Everything they'd been trained to prevent, to protect against, to eliminate before it could spread. And from the back ranks, cutting through the confused silence like a blade through silk, a voice spoke with mild annoyance. "Well, this is disappointing." Chancellor Morvain rode forward on a white horse, flanked by a dozen personal guards, whose armor bore markings Nyra didn't recognize. His expression was one of theatrical frustration rather than genuine concern. "I had hoped you'd simply kill her and be done with it, Your Majesty. Quick, clean, efficient. But it seems the ritual wasn't as thorough as the mages promised. You still have enough capacity for sentiment to hesitate at the critical moment." He gestured casually to his guards, the movement almost lazy. "Finish what the king cannot. Kill the girl. Kill anyone who stands with her. Leave no witnesses to this embarrassing display of weakness." The guards advanced with synchronized precision, their weapons drawn, moving like hunting predators who'd found wounded prey. Nyra felt her power surge in response. Exhaustion be damned. She could fight. Could probably take most of them before her reserves ran completely dry, and she collapsed. But Draxon stepped between her and the advancing soldiers, his fallen sword flying back to his hand through nothing but will. "No," he said quietly. "Your Majesty," Morvain's voice carried warning wrapped in false concern. "Stand aside. You're not thinking clearly. The stress of battle, the lingering effects of the severed bond "No," Draxon repeated, louder this time, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd almost forgotten he possessed. His sword rose, steady now, pointed directly at the Chancellor. "I said no." Morvain's expression hardened, the mask of concern dropping away to reveal cold calculation underneath. "You're having a crisis of conscience at precisely the wrong moment, Your Majesty. But no matter, the girl dies regardless. And you—" He made another gesture, sharp and commanding, and something happened that made Nyra's blood turn to ice. The Imperial soldiers moved as one, their eyes glazing over with something that wasn't quite consciousness. Their movements became synchronized in a way that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with something far more sinister. Control. Not loyalty, not discipline, not even fear. Complete absolute control of their minds and bodies. "We've been preparing for this contingency for some time," Morvain said pleasantly, as if discussing weather rather than mass enslavement. "Did you really think I'd leave the Empire's future dependent on one unreliable king? These soldiers have been conditioned over months, bound to my will through methods far more reliable than bonds or loyalty or any of those messy human attachments." He smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who'd just revealed he'd been playing a completely different game all along. Kill them both. The king and his rejected mate. Together, how poetic. The army moved as one, 5,000 soldiers flowing toward Nyra and Draxon with mechanical precision, their faces empty of anything human, their weapons raised. And Nyra understood with terrible clarity what Morvain had actually built, while everyone was distracted by the drama of kings and rejected bonds and rebellions. Not an empire of dominance, an empire of slavery, every soldier controlled, every mind bound, every person reduced to a puppet dancing on the Chancellor's strings, their autonomy and choice and fundamental humanity stripped away and replaced with blind obedience. This was what happens when someone believes control is the only path to order, when they trust nothing and no one, not even the loyalty of their own forces, when they reduce humanity to resources to be managed and manipulated and overwritten entirely if necessary. Draxon saw it too. His face went pale with horror and recognition, understanding blooming like poison in his expression. "What have you done?" he breathed. "I've built what you were too weak to build," Morvain replied calmly. "An empire that cannot fail because its people cannot choose to fail. Perfect order, perfect control. No more rebellions, no more doubts, No more messy human complications getting in the way of progress. He leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes glittering with something that might have been triumph or madness or both. And you were meant to be the figurehead, Your Majesty, the face of authority, while I held the actual power. The symbol people could love or fear while I did what was necessary to keep the empire strong. But you've become a liability, too unpredictable, too capable of sentiment. So now you die along with your rejected mate, and I'll find a more compliant replacement. The controlled soldiers closed in from all sides, weapons raised, eyes empty of anything that could be called human, moving with the coordinated precision of a single organism rather than 5,000 individuals. And Nira made a choice. She reached for Draxon's hand. He looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes, and she saw the question there. After everything, after all the pain and rejection and mutual destruction, after he'd carved their bond out of his own soul to stop feeling the agony of its corruption, after all of that, she was reaching for him. He took her hand, and the bond that should have been impossible, that should have been severed beyond any chance of reconnection, that ritual magic and desperate pain had supposedly destroyed forever, sparked to life between their joined hands. Not the same bond. Not the warmth and completion it should have been. Not the destiny fate had promised them. But something new. Something forged not in instinct or biology or cosmic design, but in choice. A mutual recognition of exactly how badly they'd both failed, how thoroughly they'd been manipulated, how desperately they both wanted to stop the monster they'd helped create through their own blindness and pain. Power exploded from their connection, silver and gold intertwining, Nyra's Valendra abilities merging with whatever strength Draxon still possessed despite the ritual. The valley itself seemed to shudder under the force of it, the ground cracking, the air itself rippling with visible distortions. The controlled soldiers staggered, the bindings on their minds cracking under the pressure of two bloodlines that had never been meant to work together but were choosing to anyway, choosing connection over certainty, choosing each other over the safety of separation. Morvaine's smile vanished like smoke. "Impossible," he hissed, his composure finally cracking. The bond was severed, the ritual was absolute, the mages swore. "You cut away the bond that existed," Nira said, her voice resonating with power that made the air vibrate. "But you can't cut away choice. And we're choosing this. Right now. Not because fate demands it, not because instinct compels it, not because it's easy or safe or what we're supposed to do." She looked at Draxon, and he looked back, and in that moment they understood each other completely. Not forgiveness, that would take years, if it ever came at all. Not reconciliation. Too much had been broken for that. Just recognition. "We can't undo what we did to each other," Draxon said quietly, his voice raw but steady. "Can't take back the rejection, or the pain, or the months of destroying ourselves and everyone around us." "No," Nira agreed. "We can't." His hand tightened on hers. "But we can choose what happens next." Together they turned to face Morvaine and the army he'd enslaved, power flowing between them in waves that seemed to bend reality itself. And the Chancellor's expression twisted with fury and something that might have been fear. "Kill them!" he screamed. All pretense of calm control shattered. "Kill them now! All of you! Tear them apart! I command it!" The soldiers advanced, mechanical and relentless. And Nyra and Draxon, hands still joined, power still flowing between them in impossible waves of silver and gold, stood their ground, ready to fight the empire they'd both helped break. Ready to face the consequences of every choice that had led them to this moment. Ready to prove that sometimes the strongest thing two people can do isn't complete each other, or submit to each other, or even love each other. It's choose each other anyway. Even when the world demands otherwise. Even when every instinct screams to protect yourself first. Even when standing together means dying together. The army crashed against them like a wave against stone, and the valley exploded with light, bright enough to blind, power enough to reshape the world. Two broken people choosing connection over safety and consequence over comfort, choosing to stand, together, against everything. The light faded slowly like dawn after the longest night. When Nyra could see again, the valley had been transformed. The ground was scorched in a perfect circle around where she and Draxon stood, still holding hands, both of them swaying with exhaustion that went deeper than physical weariness. This was the kind of tired that came from burning through reserves you didn't know you had, from pushing past every limit your body possessed. The Imperial soldiers lay scattered across the battlefield, unconscious but breathing, not dead. The power that had exploded from the impossible bond between her and Draxen hadn't killed them. It had shattered the bindings on their minds, broken Morvaine's control, and left them collapsed in the dirt like puppets with cut strings. 5,000 men, freed. The Unbound stood in shocked silence, weapons still raised, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. The air still hummed with residual energy, tasting like ozone and possibility, and the fundamental rewriting of everything they thought they understood about power. And in the center of the destruction, still mounted on his white horse but looking significantly less composed, Chancellor Morvaine stared at them with an expression that cycled rapidly through disbelief, fury, and something that might have been fear. "That's not possible," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. The bond was severed. The ritual was absolute. "You shouldn't be able to—" "You keep saying that," Naira interrupted, her voice hoarse but steady. "Keep insisting on what should and shouldn't be possible. But here's what you never understood about control, Chancellor. The tighter you grip, the more desperate you become to eliminate anything that doesn't fit your design, the more fragile your whole system becomes." She released Draxen's hand slowly, though the new bond still hummed between them, different from what it had been but undeniably real. A connection built on choice rather than fate, on mutual recognition rather than biological imperative. You tried to control everything. The king, the army, the entire empire. You made people into tools, removed their capacity for choice, their ability to question or resist or simply say no. And you thought that made you powerful. She stepped forward, and silver light flickered around her fingers despite her exhaustion. But power that requires absolute control isn't power. It's fear. And systems built on fear don't last because the moment that control slips even slightly, everything collapses. Morvaine's jaw tightened. Pretty speech. But you're still outnumbered. My guards remain loyal by choice, not compulsion. And you're exhausted. Whatever impossible thing you just did, it burned through your reserves. You can barely stand. He was right. Naira's legs trembled with the effort of staying upright. Her vision swam at the edges. The power she'd channeled through the renewed bond had taken everything she had, and then some. But she wasn't alone anymore. Draxen moved to stand beside her, his sword still in hand, and despite his own exhaustion, despite the visible strain of what they'd just done, he stood steady. "You're done, Morvaine," the king said quietly. "Whatever control you had over me, whatever manipulation you used to turn me into your weapon, it ends here." The Chancellor's expression hardened. "You think you can simply walk away from months of conditioning, from the reality of what you've become? I made you into the perfect king, Draxen, removed your weaknesses, gave you certainty. You made me into a monster," Draxen corrected, and for the first time since the ritual, real emotion flickered in his voice, raw and painful and utterly human. "You used my fear of vulnerability, my desperate need to stop hurting, and you turned me into something that could slaughter without conscience, something that could look at suffering and feel nothing." His hand clenched on his sword hilt. "I let you do it because I was too broken to see what was happening, too consumed by the pain of the severed bond to recognize I was being manipulated. But I see it now." Morvaine gestured sharply, and his personal guards advanced, a dozen elite soldiers who moved with the precision of genuine training rather than magical compulsion. "Then you see it too late," the Chancellor said coldly. "You're both exhausted, surrounded, and I still have enough loyal forces to end this." The guards closed in, weapons drawn, and Naira felt her power stir weakly in response. She could probably manage one more surge, maybe. If she pushed hard enough, burned deep enough into reserves that were already dangerously depleted, but it would kill her. She saw the same calculation in Draxen's eyes, saw him measuring the distance, counting the guards, recognizing that they were both too depleted to survive this, and saw him decide it didn't matter. Some fights you take even when you know you'll lose. The guards were 3 steps away when a voice cut across the valley, rough and absolutely furious. "Stand down!" General Thrace rode forward on a horse that looked like it had been ridden hard, his armor dust-covered, his face set with grim determination. Behind him came more soldiers, not controlled, not compelled, just men and women who'd made a choice. The general who'd retreated from Nera's camp months ago had returned, and he wasn't alone. General Kavros appeared from the other side of the valley, leading another contingent. Then General Rael from the northern campaigns. More generals, more soldiers, hundreds of them, flowing into the valley from multiple directions surrounding Morvan's position. Thrace dismounted and walked toward the chancellor with measured steps, his hand on his sword, but not drawing it. "Not yet. We figured it out," he said quietly. "Took us longer than it should have, but we finally understood what you were doing. The conditioning, the mind control, the systematic reduction of the entire Imperial army into your personal puppets." He gestured to the unconscious soldiers scattered across the battlefield. "When the bond between the king and his mate broke your control, we felt it. Every soldier you'd bound. We all felt the binding shatter, and we remembered what you'd stolen from us." Morvain's horse shifted nervously as the generals closed in, their forces creating an impenetrable ring around his position. "This is treason," the chancellor said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "You swore oaths to the Empire, to stability, to order." "We swore oaths to protect the Empire," Thrace corrected, "not to serve a chancellor who treats soldiers like meat puppets, not to enable the enslavement of everyone who wears the Imperial colors." He looked at Draxon, and something complex passed across his scarred face. "Your Majesty, we failed you, let this man manipulate you when you were vulnerable, stood by while he turned you into something you were never meant to be. For that, we ask forgiveness." Draxon was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head slowly. "I failed myself," he said. "Morvain used my weaknesses, yes, exploited my pain and my fear, but I chose to let him. Chose the ritual that severed my capacity for doubt. Chose certainty over wisdom because I was too much of a coward to sit with the pain of a broken bond." He looked at Nyra, and something in his eyes was different now. Open. Vulnerable in a way that would have terrified him months ago. "He gave me tools, but I'm the one who used them to become a tyrant. And here's the thing about accountability that people in power rarely understand. True strength isn't about refusing to acknowledge mistakes. It's about facing them directly, owning the damage you've caused, accepting that your choices have consequences even when those choices were made from a place of pain." Draxon had spent months avoiding that accountability, had let Morvain shoulder the blame, had become a weapon that could be aimed by someone else, so he never had to face what he was actually doing. But weapons don't get to claim innocence, and kings don't get to hide behind their advisor's manipulation. Morvain saw the shift in the room, the way support was draining away from him like water through a sieve. His guards looked uncertain now, glancing at each other, clearly reconsidering whether dying for a chancellor who'd enslaved thousands was worth their loyalty. "You'll regret this," Morvain said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "All of you. The Empire needs order, needs control. Without it, everything collapses into chaos." "Maybe," Nera said quietly, "or maybe what collapses is just the systems built on fear and dominance. Maybe what rises from those ruins is something better." She stepped forward despite her exhaustion, despite the way her legs trembled and her vision swam. "You're done, Morvain. Your control is broken. Your manipulation exposed. Whatever power you thought you had, it's gone." The Chancellor's hand moved towards something in his robes, quick and furtive. Draxon was faster. The king's sword flew from his hand, not thrown, but propelled by will alone, and caught Morvain's wrist before he could complete whatever desperate move he'd been reaching for. The blade pinned his arm to the saddle, drawing blood but not severing anything vital. Morvain screamed, more from rage than pain. Thrace and Kavros moved in, pulling the Chancellor from his horse, restraining him with efficiency born from decades of military service. "It's over," Thrace said simply. And it was. The battle ended not with violence, but with choice. Soldiers standing down, generals refusing orders. An empire collectively deciding that control wasn't worth the cost of their humanity. Nera's legs finally gave out, exhaustion claiming her, but Draxon caught her before she hit the ground. She looked up at him, at the man who'd rejected her, who'd become a monster, who'd somehow found his way back to something resembling human. "We're not done," she said quietly. "You and me. We've got a lot to answer for." "I know," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. He was only beginning to remember how to feel. This doesn't fix anything. I know. We might not survive what comes next. His arms tightened around her, supporting her weight, and she felt the new bond pulse between them. Different, fragile, built on choice rather than destiny. Then we face it together, he said. The aftermath took weeks to sort through. Morvain was imprisoned in the deepest cells beneath the palace, awaiting trial for crimes that seemed to accumulate daily as more evidence of his manipulation came to light. The conditioning he'd implemented went deeper than anyone had realized, affecting not just soldiers but servants, officials, even some members of the council itself. The empire was in chaos, but it was the productive kind of chaos, the kind that comes from systems being rebuilt rather than maintained, questions being asked rather than suppressed, power being redistributed rather than hoarded. Draxen abdicated, not immediately, not in a dramatic gesture that would have created more problems than it solved, but methodically, carefully, over the course of those weeks, he began transferring authority to councils and regional governors and systems that didn't depend on a single person's absolute control. Some called it weakness. Others called it wisdom. Nira called it necessary. She stood beside him through it, not as his mate in the traditional sense, not as his subject or his queen, but as someone who understood what it cost to rebuild yourself after you'd been shattered. They held court together in the great hall where he'd rejected her, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The place of their greatest failure had become the foundation for something new. Not perfect, not healed, but honest. Kale recovered from his wounds and became one of the key voices in the new council, his experience with the Unbound providing perspective on how to govern without crushing. The Eastern Territories remained autonomous, a living proof that other ways were possible. The bond between Nira and Draxen never became what it should have been. That chance was lost the moment he'd spoken rejection in front of the court. But what grew in its place was something else, something chosen rather than fated, built through shared struggle rather than biological imperative. Partnership. Not the completion they'd been promised, but something they'd earned. Thrace brought them news one morning, his expression grave. Morvain's trial is set for tomorrow. The evidence is overwhelming. He'll be executed before the week is out. Nira and Draxen exchanged glances. No, they said in unison. Thrace blinked. Your Majesties, the man enslaved thousands, manipulated the king himself, nearly destroyed the empire from within. Exactly, Draxen said quietly, which is why execution would be mercy. He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the city, the same window where he'd stood months ago, feeling the bond rot inside him, unable to understand what was happening. Prison, he continued, for the rest of his natural life. Let him live with what he did. Let him watch the empire he tried to control rebuild itself into something he can't manipulate. Let him see that his vision failed. That's harder than death, Nira agreed. Death is escape. Living with your failures is punishment. And here's the thing about justice that vengeance never teaches you. The point isn't to make yourself feel better, isn't to balance some cosmic scale. The point is to prevent future harm while acknowledging past damage. Killing Morvain would feel satisfying for about 10 seconds. Making him watch his entire philosophy proven wrong would hurt for decades. The trial proceeded with Morvain sentenced to life imprisonment. He raged, threatened, predicted the Empire's collapse without his guidance. The Empire survived anyway, not perfectly. There were struggles, regions that resisted change, factions that wanted a return to the old hierarchy, growing pains of a system learning to function without absolute authority at its center. But it survived, and more importantly, it evolved. 6 months after Morvain's imprisonment, Nira stood on the same ridge where she'd watched Draxen's army approach, preparing for a battle that had nearly destroyed them both. The valley below was different now. Communities had built homes there. Fields were being planted. Children played where soldiers had bled. Draxen approached from behind, his footsteps quiet on the rocky ground. Leaving? He asked. She nodded. The Eastern Territories need someone to help organize the expansion. More refugees arriving every day from regions that still haven't accepted the new way. They need infrastructure. Governance that isn't tyranny. We could use you here, he said. The council. The rebuilding. You've earned a voice in how the Empire moves forward." Nira turned to face him, and the bond hummed between them, that impossible connection they'd forged in the moment of their greatest desperation. "I know, but that's not my place. I'm better at building new things than maintaining old ones. Even when those old things are being rebuilt." She stepped closer, close enough to see the changes in his face, the lines that hadn't been there before, the softness around his eyes that spoke to someone learning to feel again after months of mechanical certainty. "You've changed," she said. "So have you. We both had to." He was quiet for a moment, then reached up and touched her face, gentle in a way that would have been impossible when they first met. "I never apologized," he said quietly. "Not properly. For the rejection. For the cruelty of doing it publicly. For choosing my fear over what the bond was trying to tell me." Nira placed her hand over his. "I rejected you back. Made you feel everything I felt. Became so consumed with making you understand my pain that I didn't see Morvain's manipulation until it was almost too late. So we're even?" She laughed, bitter and genuine. "We're both disasters who hurt each other so badly we had to rebuild ourselves from scratch. I don't know if that's even. But maybe even isn't the point. Maybe the point is that we survived, that we chose each other when it mattered most, that we're trying to build something better than what we destroyed." The bond pulsed, warm and steady, and nothing like the desperate, broken thing it had been. "This doesn't feel like a happy ending," Draxon said. "That's because it's not an ending," Nira replied. "It's a beginning. Messy and complicated and uncertain. But ours." She kissed him, brief and gentle, and the bond sang between them. Not completion, not destiny, just choice. "I'll come back," she said, "when the Eastern Territories are stable. When the people who fled there feel safe enough to govern themselves. And if that takes years, then it takes years." She stepped back, her hand lingering in his for a moment before releasing. "You're building something important here, Draxon, an empire that doesn't require absolute control to function, that trusts its people instead of crushing them, that sees strength in adaptation rather than dominance. And you're building something important there, a place where people can be free of all the hierarchies and systems that tried to define their worth." They smiled at each other, sad and genuine and absolutely honest. "Maybe someday those two things will merge," Nira said. "Maybe the Empire and the free territories will find a way to coexist, to learn from each other." "Maybe," Draxon agreed. "Or maybe they'll stay separate. Two different approaches to the same problems. Either way, we'll have proven something neither of us believed when we started this." "What's that?" "That there's more than one way to be strong." She turned to leave, then paused. "The bond," she said quietly. "This new one we forged. What do we call it?" Draxon considered for a moment. "A choice," he said finally. "Not a gift from fate or biology or cosmic design. Just two people who decided to stand together when everything was falling apart." Nira nodded slowly. "I like that." She walked down the ridge toward where Kael waited with horses, ready for the journey east. Draxon watched her go, one hand pressed to his chest where the bond hummed, alive and real and entirely their own creation. Behind him, the Empire waited, broken and rebuilding, struggling and surviving. No longer perfect or certain or controlled, but free. And freedom, he was learning, was worth the chaos. 10 years later. The Great Hall had been transformed, no longer a throne room where one person dispensed absolute judgment, but a council chamber where voices from across the Empire gathered to debate and decide and occasionally shout at each other about the best path forward. Draxon sat among them, no longer a king but an advisor, whose experience was valued but not considered final authority. He'd grown older, his hair showing silver at the temples, his face lined with the kind of wear that comes from difficult choices made consciously rather than mechanically. The debate today centered on trade agreements with the Eastern Territories, which had grown into their own federation of free communities. Prosperous, independent, proof that another way was possible. Nira represented them at these gatherings, traveling west several times a year to negotiate and argue and occasionally remind the Empire that freedom didn't mean chaos. She sat across the table from him now, her own face showing the passage of time, her eyes still occasionally flickering silver when she pulled on power she'd learned to control completely. The bond between them had never faded. Had grown stronger, actually, fed by years of choosing each other across distance and difference, and the occasional fundamental disagreement about policy. They didn't live together, didn't follow any traditional model of mated pairs, but they were partners in the truest sense. Two people who'd destroyed each other and been destroyed in turn, who'd learned that strength isn't about domination or submission, but about standing together when everything tries to pull you apart. The council meeting ended with agreements reached through compromise rather than decree. People filed out, still arguing, but without the desperate edge of those who fear their voices don't matter. Draxen and Nira lingered, as they often did. The Eastern Federation wants full independence recognized in the Imperial Charter, Nira said. No more ambiguous status, just acknowledgement that we're sovereign. And what do I get in return? Trade rights. Military alliance if the Northern Kingdoms start expanding again. And my promise to keep visiting. His hand found hers across the table. That last one's worth more than trade rights. She smiled. You're getting sentimental in your old age. I earned the right to be sentimental. Spent long enough being a heartless machine. How does it feel? She asked quietly. 10 years later, looking back at everything that happened. Draxen was silent for a long moment. Like the hardest thing I ever did was learning to live with what I'd become. The ritual that severed my doubt. The people I hurt when I was Morvaine's weapon. The empire I nearly destroyed through absolute certainty. He looked at her. But the best thing I ever did was choose you. Not when the bond first ignited. I failed that test. But in that valley, when everything was falling apart and choosing you meant choosing against my own survival. That's when I finally understood what strength actually means. Nira squeezed his hand. It means being brave enough to change. It means admitting you were wrong. It means building something new from the ruins of everything you destroyed. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd traveled the hardest possible road to reach something resembling peace. I should go, Nira said eventually. Long ride back east. I know. Same time next month? I'll be here. She stood but didn't immediately leave. Instead, she circled the table and pulled him into an embrace that still felt charged with power, with connection, with the bond they'd forged through choice rather than fate. We did it, she whispered. Built something better, proved it was possible. We're still building, Draxen corrected. This doesn't end. The work of making a better world doesn't have a finish line. Good, Nira said. I'd get bored with a finish line anyway. She kissed him, deep and genuine, and the bond between them sang. Then she was gone, riding east toward territories she'd helped build from nothing, toward people who'd chosen freedom over the security of empire. And Draxen returned to his work, helping an empire learn to function without absolute control, proving every day that strength isn't about dominance. It's about the courage to be wrong, the wisdom to change, the grace to build instead of destroy, and the absolute, terrifying, beautiful choice to stand with someone else even when standing alone would be safer. Some bonds are given by fate, others are forged in fire, and those forged bonds, built through choice and failure, and the willingness to keep trying even when everything falls apart, those are the ones that last, not because they're perfect, but because they're real. Earned through blood and tears, and the kind of transformation that only comes from being broken so completely that you have to rebuild yourself into something entirely new. Nira and Draxen had been broken, had broken each other, and then chosen to rebuild together, not into what they were supposed to be, but into what they chose to become. Two people, two paths, one impossible bond that existed because they decided it should, because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose love over certainty, choose partnership over dominance, choose each other again and again, even when fate itself says you shouldn't. That's not a fairy tale ending. That's something better. That's real.